The Lord of Flies. This is a true story that happened in Mexico in June 2009. I know because it happened to my brother-in-law's father. And I'm breaking my promise to him by telling you this story right now, at this very moment, knowing full well what the consequences might be for doing so. By the time Diego Reyes escaped that village 3 days later, 20 women were hanging from the trees in the plaza like grotesque ornaments on some nightmarish Christmas display. Their eyes were still open, still watching, still seeing in ways that dead eyes shouldn't be able to see. And one of them, the one hanging from the largest tree in the center of the plaza, had sent him the email that brought him there in the first place. The smell hit him first when he finally arrived at the village after that long, brutal journey. It was burned wood mixed with cooked meat, but not the pleasant smell of a backyard barbecue or a family gathering. This was something else entirely, something wrong and rotten and fundamentally corrupt. And beneath it all was the sweet, sick stench of decay of things that should have been buried long ago, but instead were left to rot in the oppressive heat. And the flies, dear God, the flies. Not just a few buzzing around garbage or animal waste, but thousands upon thousands of them, forming dark, shifting clouds that pulsed and moved with terrible purpose, as if they were a single organism with a single mind. When one landed on his lip and he tried to swat it away instinctively, he watched in horror as a woman standing behind him at the edge of the road simply opened her mouth, let a fly walk across her tongue, and then closed her jaw. The crunch was small but distinct, and Diego felt his stomach turn over as she chewed once, twice, and swallowed without any change in her blank expression. Diego told himself it was just a poor village with a sanitation problem, the kind of place where modern infrastructure hadn't quite reached where people still lived the way their grandparents had lived. That the bodies he would later see were probably effigies for some festival he didn't understand, some local tradition that looked horrifying to outsiders but made perfect sense within its cultural context. That the woman eating flies was simply engaging in a local custom bizarre and unpleasant to witness, but explainable through anthropology and sociology. But deep in his gut, in that primitive part of the brain that evolved millions of years ago to keep our ancestors alive on the African savanna, the part that knows danger before conscious thought can form words around it, he already understood with cold certainty he'd walked into something that shouldn't exist in the modern world, something that belonged to an older, darker time when demons were real and hell had doors that opened onto the earth. There's a particular weight to keeping a secret when someone makes you promise never to tell, when they look you in the eyes and make you swear on everything you hold sacred that you'll take what they told you to your grave. Right now, as I sit here recording this story, typing these words onto a screen in the dead of night while my own family sleeps upstairs, I'm caught between two equally powerful betrayals. The first is breaking Diego's trust, violating the promise I made to him when he finally told me what happened in that village, when he showed me the scars, both physical and psychological, that he carried back from that place. The second betrayal, perhaps even worse, is letting this story disappear completely, allowing it to be erased from history as if it never happened, as if those 20 women never lived and died and hung from those trees with their eyes still watching. Because what occurred in that nameless village in the mountains of northern Mexico did happen as surely as the sun rises and sets, as surely as flies are drawn to death. And no one documented it. No one wrote about it in newspapers or investigated it for television. No one except Diego bore witness to what happened there, and soon he'll be gone too, and then the story will die with him unless I tell it now. Let me take you back to where it all started, back to the beginning, before Diego knew what he was walking into, before the flies and the bodies and the thing in the plaza. 3 weeks before Diego found himself standing among those hanging corpses, 3 weeks before the flies and the impossible smiles, and the entity that spoke without words, before everything went so terribly, irreversibly wrong. Diego Reyes was 22 years old that summer of 2009, still young enough to believe he could change the world, still idealistic enough to think that truth and justice mattered more than survival and self-preservation. He came from money, not just comfortable middle-class money, but the kind of old Mexico City wealth that insulates you completely from the uglier realities that most people in this country face every single day. His family owned property in Polanco, one of the most expensive neighborhoods in Latin America. He attended a private university where tuition cost more than most Mexican families earned in a year. He wore clothes with designer labels and owned a watch that could have fed a village for a month. But despite all that privilege, or perhaps because of it, Diego felt guilty. He felt like he hadn't earned any of it, like he was living off his father's reputation and his grandfather's business acumen without contributing anything of value to the world. His father, Don Roberto Reyes, was a journalist of the old guard, a dying breed in an era of bloggers and social media influencers. Not some amateur with a laptop and strong opinions, but the kind of serious, respected reporter whose byline appeared in magazines with national circulation, whose articles had brought down corrupt politicians and exposed corporate malfeasance. The kind of journalist who received manila envelopes slipped under his door at 3 a.m, envelopes containing documents that powerful people didn't want, made public evidence of crimes that would never see the inside of a courtroom without someone like Don Roberto shining a light on them. The kind of journalist that desperate people came to when they had absolutely nowhere else to turn, when the police had failed them, and the courts had failed them, and they needed anyone to care about what had happened to them or their families. Don Roberto's study was a shrine to unanswered pleas, a monument to suffering that had been acknowledged but not addressed. The massive oak desk that dominated the room disappeared beneath mountains of correspondence, physical letters from campesinos, whose land had been stolen by corporations with government connections, whose families had been farming the same soil for generations before lawyers showed up with forged documents and armed men. There were emails from mothers of the disappeared women whose sons and daughters had been taken by cartels or corrupt police, or sometimes it was impossible to tell the difference, women who begged for anyone to care that their children were gone. There were desperate messages from factory workers who'd been fired for asking about safety violations, about the toxic chemicals they were exposed to every day, about the co-workers who had gotten sick or died and whose deaths were ruled accidents, even though everyone knew better. They all wrote to Don Roberto. They all begged him to give voice to what no one else would hear, to shine his journalist's light on their dark corners of injustice and suffering. And he read everything Diego knew because he'd watched his father sort through the mail over breakfast countless times. His reading glasses sliding down his nose, his coffee going cold and forgotten. As he absorbed tragedy after tragedy, his face getting grayer and more exhausted with each letter. But Don Roberto rarely answered any of them. "You have to choose your battles, hijo," he'd say whenever Diego pressed him about it, whenever Diego asked why he didn't respond to this letter or that email, why he didn't investigate this claim or that accusation. "One man can't fix everything that's broken in this country. If I chase every story, if I try to help everyone who asks, I accomplish nothing. I spread myself so thin that I become useless." You learn to prioritize, to pick the battles you can actually win, the stories that can actually make a difference. The rest... He would trail off and gesture at the piles of correspondence with a weary wave of his hand, as if to say the rest simply didn't matter, couldn't matter, because there were too many, and life was too short. Diego couldn't accept that philosophy couldn't stomach it. At 22, idealism burns with an intensity that age and experience eventually temper or extinguish. Compromise tastes like cowardice. Half measures feel like betrayal. Since his first year at the private university, since he'd started taking journalism classes and reading his father's old articles and learning about the power of the press to expose wrongdoing, It had eaten at him like acid watching his father sit comfortably behind that mountain of unanswered suffering, doing nothing, choosing comfort over action. Diego believed with the fierce certainty of youth that real journalism meant going to where the pain was getting dirt under your fingernails, looking traumatized people in the eye, and documenting exactly what was wrong with the world. Not just writing eloquent columns from a comfortable office in one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in Mexico City, not just collecting awards at ceremonies where everyone wore expensive suits and congratulated each other on their bravery, while actual brave people died in obscurity trying to tell the truth about cartels or corruption or the daily grinding poverty that killed more people than any violence. Diego wanted desperately to prove something, though he couldn't have articulated exactly what. Maybe to his father, to show the old man that journalism still mattered, that one person really could make a difference if they actually got off their ass and tried. Maybe to himself, to prove that he wasn't just a spoiled rich kid playing at being a reporter, that he had courage and integrity and was willing to suffer for the truth. Maybe to both of them, or maybe to neither, maybe just to that nagging voice in his own head that whispered he was a fraud and a hypocrite, that his privilege was unearned and his comfort was built on the suffering of people he'd never met and never would meet unless he did anything to justify his existence. That's why on a Tuesday afternoon in early June 2009, while his father was away at a journalism conference in Monterrey, Diego made the decision that would change his life forever. He went into his father's study, that sanctum sanctorum where he'd been told repeatedly never to enter without permission, and committed what he knew was a violation of trust. He told himself later it wasn't really snooping, wasn't really a betrayal, just curiosity, concern even. He was worried about his father, about the toll all that unaddressed suffering was taking on the old man's soul. But when he opened his father's laptop, the password was embarrassingly easy. Just his mother's birthday in a simple numerical format that anyone could have guessed, and clicked on the email application. What he found made his breath catch in his throat and his heart start racing. 847 unread messages. 847 people who had reached out for help and been ignored. Diego spent the entire day reading them, unable to tear himself away, despite growing hunger and thirst, and the uncomfortable ache in his bladder from sitting too long without a break. He didn't eat lunch, didn't answer when his girlfriend Maria called his cell phone twice, wondering where he was and what he was doing. He just clicked through message after message, each one sadder and more desperate than the last. There were the predictable scams, of course, the Nigerian princes and the lottery winnings and the dying millionaires who wanted to give away their fortunes, but mixed in with the obvious fraud were real pleas from real people suffering real injustices. There were messages about scam artist preachers who preyed on the faithful, convincing poor families to donate money they couldn't afford to churches that enriched the pastors while promising miracles that never came. There were accounts of corrupt police executing teenagers in the street, and then planting weapons on their bodies of families who knew their children were innocent, but had no way to prove it, and no one who would listen even if they could. There were desperate emails about poisoned water supplies where children were getting sick and dying from drinking contaminated water, while officials insisted everything was fine, where companies dumped toxic waste and paid off inspectors to look the other way. There were stories about missing children, so many missing children, some taken by cartels for reasons Diego didn't want to think about, others simply vanished, as if they'd never existed, as if they'd been erased from reality itself. There were pleas from families facing land grabs, forced from homes their ancestors had built with their own hands, by corporations with lawyers and guns and government connections. It was an ocean of suffering, a tsunami of pain and injustice and desperate need, and his father had simply looked away from all of it, had let it pile up in his inbox like junk mail, like something that could be safely ignored. Then, buried deep in that digital graveyard somewhere around message 612, Diego found something different. something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The email was short, only a few lines, and badly spelled, the kind of writing that suggested either limited formal education or someone typing frantically on an unfamiliar keyboard, not caring about grammar or punctuation, just desperate to get the words out before something stopped them. The sender's name was Elena Vargas, and the email address was clearly created in haste, vargas_2009@hotmail.com, just a random string of letters and numbers, the kind of disposable account you create quickly at an internet cafe when you need anonymity, when you don't want anyone to trace the message back to you. The subject line read simply, "Nos están cazando." They are hunting us. The message itself was even more brief and more disturbing. "Están quemando brujas aquí. Ayúdanos antes de que sea tarde." They are burning witches here. Help us before it's too late. That was it. No coordinates, no specific street address or village name. Just a vague mention of a community lost somewhere between two mountain ranges in one of the northern states, a place Diego could barely locate on a map, even though he'd lived in Mexico his entire life. The email had been sent 3 weeks ago on a Tuesday evening according to the timestamp, and there had been no follow-up message, no second attempt to reach out. Just that one desperate plea floating in his father's inbox alongside hundreds of others, unread and unanswered. Diego read it 5 times, then 10, then lost count. His father had never opened it. It had sat in that inbox for 3 weeks like a time bomb that no one had bothered to defuse, like a scream in the dark that no one had cared enough to investigate. Witches. The word felt almost quaint, like something from a fairy tale or a history book about medieval Europe or the Salem trials. Diego knew enough anthropology and sociology to understand that witch hunt was usually a metaphor, a convenient shorthand for describing persecution and scapegoating, for the age-old human tendency to blame the vulnerable and the different when things go wrong and someone needs to be punished. His father had explained it to him years ago when covering a story about indigenous women in Oaxaca who'd been accused of causing a drought through witchcraft, women who were really being targeted because they owned valuable land that men in the village wanted to control. They called them brujas, his father had said over dinner one night, gesturing with his fork for emphasis, but what they really mean is women we want to get rid of, women who own land that men want. Women who refuse to remarry after their husbands die, women who speak up in community meetings or challenge traditional authority, women who threaten the established order in any way. It's the oldest trick in the book if you want to destroy someone and take what they have accused them of witchcraft. Once that accusation is made, once that label is applied, you can do anything to them and call it justice. That's what this email had to be describing, Diego thought. Some isolated village caught up in old superstitions and patriarchal control, probably targeting indigenous women or widows or anyone else vulnerable, using accusations of witchcraft to justify violence and theft. It was exactly the kind of story his father should have pursued, exactly the kind of injustice that serious journalism was supposed to expose and stop. The kind of story that could save lives if someone with a platform and credibility shone a light on it before it was too late. But one line in Elena Vargas's brief email made Diego's skin prickle with an unease he couldn't quite name or explain. Las moscas lo saben todo. The flies know everything. That was strange, wasn't it? Poetic almost. Not the kind of thing you'd write in a desperate plea for help, unless it meant something specific, unless it was some kind of code or reference that Diego didn't understand. Flies knowing everything. What did that mean? Was it a metaphor, a local saying, or something else entirely? Diego saved the email address to his phone, but he didn't respond to it, didn't want to tip off his father that he'd been snooping through private correspondence, didn't want to deal with that confrontation until he had something concrete to show for his transgression. Instead, he spent the next 2 days researching obsessively, barely sleeping, searching online for any information about witch accusations or violence against women in northern Mexico. He found the state capital easily enough on maps and in census data, but after that the trail went cold. There was no village with the characteristics mentioned in the email, no news reports about witch accusations or vigilante justice. No human rights organizations working in the area. Nothing at all, as if the place Elena Vargas was writing from simply didn't exist on any official record, as if it had been erased from maps and databases, or perhaps had never been recorded in the first place. That should have been a warning, a giant red flag telling Diego to let this go, to leave it alone, to understand that some places are remote and isolated for good reasons. But Diego didn't listen to that warning. He was 22 and immortal and convinced of his own righteousness. On Friday morning, June 12, 2009, Diego told his father over breakfast that he needed to get away for a few days to clear his head, that the stress of upcoming exams and some personal issues were weighing on him, and he just needed some space to think. Don Roberto, distracted by a column deadline about escalating cartel violence in border states, barely looked up from his laptop as he pulled out his wallet and handed over 8,000 pesos, more than most Mexicans earned in a month, without asking any questions about where Diego was going or what he planned to do with the money. "Be safe," Don Roberto said absently, his eyes still on his screen. "And Diego, stay out of trouble. Don't go looking for problems where there aren't any." If only Diego had listened to that advice. Diego bought a one-way ticket on the executive bus line, the luxury coaches with reclining seats and air conditioning and Wi-Fi, the kind of buses that made the poor folks on the regular buses stare with envy and resentment. He told himself he'd buy the return ticket. Once he knew how long the investigation would take, once he'd found Elena Vargas and documented whatever was happening in that village, and maybe, just maybe, saved some lives. He told his girlfriend Maria that he'd be back in 4 or 5 days, just a quick research trip for an independent study project he was working on. He didn't tell her where he was going because he didn't really know himself, and also because some part of him knew she'd try to talk him out of it, knew she'd point out all the obvious dangers and logical flaws in his plan, and he didn't want to hear it. The bus left Mexico City at exactly noon on Friday, June 12, 2009, pulling out of the terminal into the chaotic traffic of the capital. 9 hours stretched ahead of him, 9 hours of watching the landscape change through tinted windows as the bus carried him north. The urban sprawl of Mexico City gradually gave way to brown hills, dotted with scrub brush and the occasional cluster of buildings. Then mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still holding snow despite the summer heat. Then the high desert of the north opened up vast and empty and beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way that made Diego understand why the Spanish conquistadors had hated this country, why they'd called it a wasteland, even as they stripped it of silver and gold. Diego had a comfortable reclining seat near the back of the bus, away from the bathroom smell, but close enough to make quick trips when necessary. The air conditioning worked perfectly, keeping the temperature pleasant despite the brutal heat outside. He even had Wi-Fi for the first 3 hours, though the signal got progressively weaker as they moved farther from the city. He watched a movie on his laptop, something mindless and American with explosions and car chases that he forgot the moment it ended. He dozed for a while, his head against the window, dreaming of nothing in particular. He felt like an adventurer preparing for something important, something meaningful, something that would finally prove he was more than just a rich kid playing at journalism. The executive bus arrived at the state capitol at exactly 9 p.m. on Friday night, right on schedule. The terminal was small and poorly maintained compared to the modern facility he'd departed from in Mexico City. Fluorescent lights that flickered cracked tile floors, the smell of diesel fuel and old grease, and too many people in too small a space. The air was thick and hot despite the late hour, the kind of heat that doesn't dissipate after sunset, but instead sits heavy like a blanket, making it hard to breathe. That's when Diego's comfortable journey ended, when reality started to intrude on his adventure fantasy. Diego showed Elena's email to 3 different ticket agents working the various bus lines, asking politely if they knew the village she'd mentioned, if they had any routes that went in that general direction. All 3 of them looked at the phone screen displaying the email for a long, uncomfortable moment, their faces shifting through expressions Diego couldn't quite read, confusion maybe, or concern, or something else. Then they shook their heads and said they'd never heard of any place like that, couldn't help him. One woman, older and heavy-set with tired eyes, actually physically backed away from him slightly when he pressed the question as if the very topic itself was dangerous, as if just talking about it might cause some kind of contamination. "No sé nada de eso," she said firmly, her voice brooking no argument. "I don't know anything about that. Don't ask me again." Diego spent the next hour and a half approaching people in the terminal, randomly showing them the email on his phone, asking if they recognized the description of the village or knew anything about witch accusations in the region. Most people simply ignored him, hurrying past with their luggage or their children not wanting to get involved with whatever problem this obvious outsider was dealing with. A few stopped long enough to study him with expressions that might have been pity or might have been contempt, this obviously wealthy city kid in his expensive hiking boots and North Face jacket and designer jeans playing at being a journalist, pretending to care about the problems of people he'd never understand. Around 10:30 p.m., Diego was ready to give up. He'd find a cheap hotel near the terminal, get some sleep, and catch the bus back to Mexico City in the morning. He'd tell Maria he'd changed his mind, tell his father he'd decided the story wasn't worth pursuing. His father had been right all along. You can't save everyone. Some battles aren't worth choosing, and some questions are better left unasked. But then he overheard 2 women talking near the entrance to the public bathrooms, their voices low and urgent. One of them mentioned Las Brujas, and a village name he didn't quite catch, but that sent a thrill of recognition through him. Diego approached them quickly, probably too quickly, definitely too eagerly, his desperation obvious. "Excuse me," he said, slightly out of breath. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm looking for information about a village in the mountains." The younger woman, maybe 30, cut him off immediately. "We don't know anything." Her voice was flat hostile, her eyes warning him not to push. But the older woman, maybe 60, with a face weathered by too much sun and too much hardship, studied him carefully for a long moment. Her eyes were sharp, intelligent, assessing. "Why do you want to know about that place?" Diego explained, words tumbling out in a rush. He was a journalism student. He'd received information about accusations of witchcraft, about women being persecuted. He just wanted to understand what was happening, maybe help if he could maybe document it so the authorities or human rights organizations could intervene. The woman's expression didn't change throughout his explanation. After a long silence that stretched uncomfortably, she finally said, "There's a combi that goes up toward the mountains tomorrow morning. 6 a.m. departure. It stops at many villages along the way. Maybe yours is one of them." Her tone suggested she already knew it was that she knew exactly which village Diego was looking for, even if she wouldn't name it directly. Which village specifically, Diego pressed, pulling out his phone to take notes. "What's it called? How will I know when I've reached it?" The woman was already walking away, but she called back over her shoulder without turning around. "You'll know when you get there. If you still want to go once you see it, well, that's your choice. But some doors, once you walk through them, you can't walk back." Then she was gone, disappearing into the crowd, before Diego could ask what she meant by that cryptic warning. Diego slept badly that night in a cheap hotel near the terminal, the kind of place with stained sheets and suspicious smells and noise from the street that never stopped. He kept waking up in a panic, checking his phone, for the time terrified he'd oversleep and miss the 6 a.m. combi. When the alarm finally went off at 5:30 a.m. on Saturday, June 13th, he'd barely gotten 3 hours of actual rest. His eyes were gritty and burning, his mouth tasted like something had died in it, and his body ached from the uncomfortable mattress. But he got up anyway, got dressed, gathered his things, walked to the terminal in the pre-dawn darkness. The combi was exactly what he'd expected from the description. A battered white van with bench seats running along both sides, no seat belts, windows that didn't quite close properly, letting in dust and exhaust fumes. The driver was a heavy-set man in his 50s who chain-smoked cigarettes without pause and didn't seem to care that half his passengers were coughing from the smoke. Diego was clearly the only person who looked out of place in the vehicle. Everyone else was local campesinos heading back to their villages after selling produce or buying supplies in the city, women with shopping bags full of goods they couldn't get in their remote communities, an old man carrying a live chicken in a wire cage that clucked nervously and smelled terrible. They all stared at Diego when he climbed in and paid his fare. Not curious stares, not friendly stares, assessing stares. Cold stares, like they were trying to figure out what he was worth, what threat he posed, what he wanted from their world, whether he was police or cartel, or just another idiot journalist who would get himself killed asking the wrong questions to the wrong people. The combi lurched out of the terminal at 6:15 a.m., 15 minutes late, the driver apparently unconcerned with schedules or punctuality. For the first hour, they traveled on paved roads winding up into the foothills, through landscape that was beautiful in the early morning light, golden and brown and green with mountains rising in the distance like sleeping giants. Then the pavement ended abruptly, giving way to dirt roads that hadn't been maintained in years, if ever roads that turned the ride into a bone-rattling ordeal that made Diego's teeth click together and his spine compress with every pothole and rut. Diego's tailbone started aching after 30 minutes of this abuse. After 2 hours, he could barely feel his legs, could barely sit still, every muscle in his lower body screaming for relief. But there was nowhere to go, nothing to do except endure it, and hope they'd arrive wherever they were going before his skeleton shook itself apart. And that's when Diego first noticed the flies. At first, just a few of them buzzing lazily around the windows that didn't quite close, drifting in through the gaps to circle inside the hot, stuffy interior of the combi. Easy to dismiss, easy to ignore. Just normal flies doing what flies do, attracted to the smell of humans and the chicken in the cage, and whatever food people might have in their bags. But as they climbed higher into the mountains, as the temperature rose despite the early hour and the air grew thick and heavy, there were more of them. Many more. They came through the gaps in the windows in increasing numbers, landing on people's arms and faces and bags without hesitation, without fear. Diego watched, fascinated and disturbed, as a fly landed directly on a woman's lower lip. She didn't react at all, didn't blow it away with a puff of breath, didn't brush it off with her hand, didn't even seem to notice it. She just let it walk across her mouth as if it were the most natural thing in the world, as if flies landing on your lips was something that happened all the time and wasn't worth acknowledging. Around 8 a.m. on Saturday morning, the combi started stopping at villages, tiny clusters of houses scattered along the road, most made of concrete blocks with corrugated metal roofs, some not even that substantial, just wood and tarp and hope. A few passengers got off at each stop, shouldering their bags and stepping down into the dust without saying goodbye to anyone, without acknowledging the driver or their fellow passengers. Diego asked the driver each time whether this was the village mentioned in the email, whether this was the place he was looking for. The driver just shook his head without taking the cigarette from his mouth, didn't even look at Diego in the rearview mirror, just put the vehicle in gear and continued driving, as if Diego hadn't spoken. By 9:30 a.m. on Saturday, June 13, 2009, only 3 passengers remained in the combi besides Diego. The driver pulled over at what looked like the absolute middle of nowhere, just a dirt road flanked by barbed wire fencing that stretched off in both directions as far as Diego could see, no buildings visible, no signs of human habitation at all. To the left, a stagnant lake covered in green scum that didn't move or ripple despite the light breeze. To the right, a field with several emaciated cows standing motionless in the heat, their ribs visible, their heads hanging low. "This is your stop," the driver said, looking at Diego in the rearview mirror for the first time during the entire journey. "But there's no village here," Diego protested, looking out the window at the empty landscape. "There's nothing here at all. Walk up that road," the driver said, gesturing with his cigarette toward a narrow path that led away from the main road, climbing up into rocky terrain. "Half-hour, maybe less if you walk fast. Maybe more if you're soft." He lit another cigarette from the ember of the one he'd just finished. "I come back at 7 p.m. Only trip back today. Don't miss it." Diego climbed out of the combi at approximately 9:45 a.m. on Saturday morning, stepping down into dirt that was already baking in the sun. The heat hit him like a physical force, like walking into an oven somewhere well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, with air so dry it seemed to actively leach moisture from his skin and lungs. He adjusted his backpack on his shoulders, pulled out the cheap campesino-style hat he'd bought at the terminal in an attempt to blend in and look less like a wealthy tourist, and started walking up the narrow path the driver had indicated. The flies were immediate and relentless. They swarmed around his head in numbers that seemed impossible, that seemed like something from a biblical plague. They landed on his neck, his arms, the brim of his hat, his ears, his face. Diego kept swatting them away reflexively, his hands moving constantly, but they returned within seconds every single time, persistent and fearless, and seemingly immune to his attempts to drive them off. He'd never experienced flies like this in his entire life. They seemed to have absolutely no instinct for self-preservation, no wariness of humans at all, as if they knew they were protected somehow, as if they understood they were invulnerable. The road climbed gradually for the first 15 minutes, turning from hard-packed dirt to loose stones and broken branches that made every step uncertain. Diego's legs already ached from the hours in the combi, and now his expensive hiking boots, which had seemed like such a good investment in the store in Mexico City, felt like they were filled with sand, like every step was pushing through concrete. The sun beat down relentlessly from a sky that was perfectly clear and perfectly blue and perfectly merciless. He drank half his bottled water in the first 15 minutes, the lukewarm liquid doing almost nothing to quench his thirst, then forced himself to slow down and conserve what remained, understanding that dehydration was a real danger and he had no idea how far he'd need to walk. Ahead on the path, something dark lay sprawled across the dirt. As Diego got closer, walking more slowly now, his stomach turned over with revulsion. It was a dead dog, its body bloated in the heat and split open, its insides exposed and crawling with flies in numbers that made the insects on Diego's skin seem like nothing. But the sheer density of them, the way they clustered and moved together, made the dog's corpse look almost like a person. Crouching there on hands and knees, made it look like something alive, devouring what remained of the animal. For just a second, in the heat shimmer that made the air itself seem to warp and bend, Diego could have sworn the fly-covered mass turned to look at him, could have sworn he saw eyes in that seething black cloud, regarding him with interest or hunger or recognition. He walked faster, his heart racing for no reason he could articulate. After another 10 minutes of climbing, the road curved sharply, and Diego saw a figure approaching from the opposite direction, coming down the path he was ascending. An old woman wrapped in a dark rebozo, despite the brutal heat, carrying a plastic bucket that looked empty based on how easily she swung it. She walked with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who knew the heat wasn't going anywhere. That rushing would only make things worse, that you survived out here by conserving energy and accepting that everything took longer than it should. "Buenos dias," Diego called out when they were close enough for conversation, putting on his friendliest smile, the one that usually charmed old ladies and made them want to help him. The woman stopped walking. She stared at him for a long moment without responding, her eyes narrowed against the sun, or perhaps in suspicion, her expression completely unreadable. "You're not from here," she said finally. not a question. A statement of obvious fact. Diego almost laughed at how transparent he must be, how impossible it was to disguise his origins, despite his attempts. "No, señora. I'm from Mexico City." "I'm a journalism student. I'm looking for—" "I know you're not from here," she interrupted, her voice flat and emotionless as concrete. "That's why you shouldn't be here. That's why you should turn around right now and go back to wherever you came from and forget you ever heard of this place." The smile died on Diego's face. A chill ran down his spine despite the oppressive heat. "I'm sorry." The woman didn't elaborate or explain. She just gestured vaguely up the path with her free hand, the one not holding the bucket, and said, "Does this road lead to the village?" Diego managed, trying to recover his friendly tone, trying to sound casual and non-threatening. The woman didn't answer directly. She just gestured vaguely up the path with her free hand. "Last combi is at 7 tonight. Don't miss it. If you miss it, you'll regret it more than anything you've ever regretted in your life." Diego nodded, mumbled thanks, and started to walk past her, eager to put distance between himself and her strange, unsettling energy. That's when he saw it happen, when he witnessed something that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. A fly landed on the woman's lower lip while she was watching him pass. Diego saw it clearly, a large, fat fly, the kind that feeds on dead things, settling on her mouth as if it belonged there. He watched, expecting her to blow it away or brush it off with her hand, to react with the normal human revulsion that everyone has toward flies on their face. Instead, the woman's mouth remained slightly open, her lips parted just enough. The fly walked across her lower lip casually, as if exploring, then stepped onto her tongue. Then she closed her mouth. Diego heard the crunch. Small but distinct, impossible to mistake for anything else. The sound of an exoskeleton breaking, of a body being crushed between teeth. The woman's jaw worked once, twice, her cheeks moving slightly as she chewed. Then she swallowed her throat, moving visibly, and opened her mouth to speak again, as if nothing unusual had just happened. "Remember, 7 o'clock. The combi won't wait for anyone." Then she walked past him and continued down the path toward the main road, disappearing around the curve, leaving Diego standing there frozen in shock and horror and complete confusion. Diego stood motionless for several seconds, his mind trying desperately to process what he'd just witnessed, to fit it into some framework that made sense. Some kind of protein supplement, an old folk remedy for some illness. A religious practice he didn't understand. But the woman's total nonchalance, the absolute casualness with which she'd done it, the way she'd chewed and swallowed as if she were eating a piece of candy rather than a living insect, that was what made Diego's skin crawl. What made some primitive part of his brain start screaming warnings that he chose to ignore. He forced himself to keep walking up the path. The sun climbed higher in the cloudless sky. The flies grew even more persistent, even more numerous. And with every step, Diego's certainty grew that he'd made a terrible mistake coming here, that he should have listened to his father, should have stayed in Mexico City where he belonged. By the time he finally crested the rise and saw the village spread out below him in the valley, it was nearly 11 a.m. on Saturday morning. The heat was at its absolute peak now, the air shimmering with waves that made distances hard to judge, and objects seemed to waver as if they weren't quite solid. There were maybe 20 structures visible, possibly 25, all of them low concrete buildings with metal roofs that would be like ovens in this heat, death traps if you had to spend all day inside them. There was no movement visible in the streets below, no children playing, no people walking between buildings, no dogs or chickens or any sign of normal village life. Just a few dogs lying in whatever shade they could find, panting with their tongues out, and everywhere, coating every surface, filling the air impossible to ignore, were flies. Diego counted 3 dogs that he could see from his vantage point. All 3 of them wore coats of flies so thick the insects looked like black fur, like some kind of bizarre biological clothing. The dogs didn't seem to notice or care, didn't try to shake them off or scratch at them. There was no welcome sign marking the entrance to the village, no indication of its name on any building, no tourist information or municipal office or anything that would tell a visitor where they were or what this place was called. Just these buildings arranged haphazardly around what looked like a central plaza, and the overwhelming sense that every shuttered window was watching him approach, that the village was aware of his presence and was waiting to see what he would do. Diego checked his watch, 10:17 a.m. on Saturday, June 13, 2009. 8 hours and 43 minutes until the combi would return at 7 p.m. It felt like a lifetime stretched ahead of him, like an eternity to endure before he could escape this place that already felt wrong in ways he couldn't articulate. He took a deep breath, adjusted his backpack one final time, and started walking down the slope toward the village, toward whatever was waiting for him there. He had no idea that he would never be the same person again, that the Diego Reyes walking down that slope was about to die in every way that mattered, even if his body would eventually make it back to Mexico City alive. Diego found the small tienda within minutes of entering the village, though found might be too generous a word. It was impossible to miss, being the only building with any kind of commercial signage at all. A faded Coca-Cola logo had been painted directly onto the crumbling stucco wall sometime in the distant past, the red now more pink than anything, the white letters barely legible. Below it, a hand-lettered sign read Abarrotes, in letters that had once been bright red but were now the color of dried blood, the paint cracking and peeling away in long strips that revealed the concrete beneath. He pushed through the door at exactly 10:25 a.m., and a small bell attached to the frame jingled cheerfully, absurdly out of place in this grim setting. Inside, the air was thick and heavy, almost solid with humidity, despite the desert climate outside. The smell was overwhelming, burnt copal incense mixed with cheap insecticide, the kind that comes in aerosol cans with warnings in multiple languages and skull and crossbones symbols on the label, the kind that probably causes cancer or birth defects, but is all people can afford in places like this. Behind a counter cluttered with packages of cookies that looked like they'd been sitting there for months, bottles of warm soda covered in dust, and bags of chips with expiration dates that had passed years ago, an older woman sat watching a small television. The screen was tiny, maybe 13 inches, and the image quality was terrible, all static and ghost images, but Diego could make out news footage of a warehouse fire, somewhere black smoke billowing into a gray sky, while firefighters stood around looking helpless. "Buenas tardes," Diego said politely, removing his hat and holding it in both hands like a supplicant approaching a throne. Sweat dripped down his temples, down the back of his neck, soaking into his collar. His shirt was already plastered to his back. The woman looked him up and down without responding, her examination slow and deliberate and completely shameless. Her eyes were dark, almost black in the dim light of the shop, and utterly unreadable. She took in every detail: his expensive hiking boots that probably cost more than she made in a month, his clean clothes that had never seen real labor, the watch on his wrist that could have fed her family for half a year. She looked back at the television as if he'd ceased to exist, as if he were less interesting than footage of a warehouse burning in some city hundreds of miles away. "I'm looking for a place to stay," Diego continued, forcing himself to keep his voice friendly and non-threatening, though something about this woman made him want to turn around and leave immediately. "Do you know if there's anywhere in the village I could rent a room just for one night, maybe two? I'm not particular about the accommodations. Anything would be fine, really." The woman let out a laugh, sharp and humorless and utterly devoid of warmth, more like a bark from a dog than human laughter. "There's nothing like that here. This isn't that kind of place. We don't have tourists. We don't want tourists." Diego nodded, ready to thank her for her time and leave and figure something else out. Maybe he could walk to the next village, however far that might be, or find a barn or abandoned building where he could wait out the day until the combi returned. But as he turned toward the door, as his hand reached for the handle, the woman spoke again, her voice cutting through the humid air like a knife. "Where did you come from? And why?" He turned back slowly, carefully, like you might turn to face a predator you've suddenly realized is watching you. Her eyes were fixed on him now with an intensity that made his skin crawl, no longer pretending to watch the television, giving him her full attention in a way that felt threatening rather than welcoming. "I'm from Mexico City," Diego said, choosing his words carefully, suddenly aware that what he said next might matter more than he understood. "I'm a journalism student. I'm doing some personal research for a project about rural life and traditional communities." He'd prepared that lie on the bus ride, thinking it sounded plausible and non-threatening, but the moment the words left his mouth, he knew they weren't working. The woman's expression shifted, not quite hostile, but deeply suspicious, her eyes narrowing and her lips pressing together in a thin line. She studied him for what felt like a full minute, though his watch would have told him it was only about 15 seconds' time, stretching and warping under her gaze. Finally, she said, "There's a woman, Señora Rosa. She lives behind the old mill on the north side of the village. Sometimes she rents a room to people passing through. If you don't mind it being humble, if you can accept things as they are without asking too many questions, that would be perfect. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your help." The woman quoted him a price for bottled water without being asked 50 pesos 5 times what it should cost, even in a remote location highway robbery in any reasonable economy. Diego paid without arguing, without even commenting on the absurd markup, noticing how she watched him the entire time he counted out bills from his wallet, how her eyes tracked every movement of his hands, how she seemed to be calculating exactly how much money he was carrying. She didn't say thank you when she took the bills, didn't count them or even look at them, just took the money and shoved it into a drawer behind the counter without breaking eye contact, as if the money didn't matter at all, as if she'd been testing something else entirely with that transaction. As Diego pocketed his change and picked up the lukewarm bottle of water, the woman asked with studied casualness, "Did you come here alone? No friends, no colleagues, no one who knows exactly where you are?" "Yes, I came alone." She smiled then, but there was absolutely no warmth in it, no kindness, no human connection. Just lips pulling back from yellowed teeth that should have been white, revealing gaps where molars had been lost to age or poverty or violence. Some things you shouldn't come to see alone. Some doors should only be opened when you have witnesses, when you have people who can pull you back if you go too far. But you're already here, aren't you? Already through the door, already past the point where warnings matter. Diego felt a chill, despite the oppressive heat that made the air itself seem to shimmer and warp. "What things? What are you talking about?" But the woman had already turned back to her television, turning up the volume with a remote control that had most of its buttons missing the plastic, cracked and held together with tape, as if he'd ceased to exist once again, as if their conversation had never happened and he was just a ghost she'd chosen to stop seeing. Outside at 10:40 a.m., the heat seemed even worse after the relative cool of the tienda's thick walls. Diego unscrewed the water bottle and took a long drink, the liquid lukewarm and tasting faintly of plastic and something else he couldn't identify, something slightly chemical. A fly landed on his hand and wouldn't leave no matter how many times he shook it, just repositioning itself, walking across his knuckles with tiny legs that he could actually feel, despite their minuscule size. "You asked about Señora Rosa." Diego spun around his heart, jumping into his throat, water sloshing from the bottle onto his hand. A man stood there, maybe 50 years old, average height, wearing a faded cap and skin weathered to the texture of old leather by years of sun exposure and hard labor. He said he'd overheard the conversation inside the tienda, had been standing just outside the door the whole time, and could show Diego the way to Rosa's house if he wanted. His voice was friendly enough, but his eyes never quite met Diego's, always sliding away to look at something over Diego's shoulder or off to the side. They walked through streets that felt abandoned, despite being late morning on what should have been a busy Saturday. Every house had its windows covered with blankets or sheets of metal or boards nailed across the openings, as if the people inside couldn't bear to look out at their own village, as if seeing what was outside was somehow worse than the darkness within. No children played in the dusty streets. No one sat in doorways seeking relief from the heat. No one hung laundry or swept their stoops or did any of the thousand small tasks that define life in a small village. Just the oppressive silence and the constant drone of flies, that background noise that never stopped, that Diego was starting to realize he could hear even when he couldn't see the insects themselves, as if the sound had infected his mind and was now playing continuously in his head regardless of external reality. The man talked without being asked, filling the silence with a stream of words that sounded rehearsed, like a speech he'd given before to other curious outsiders who'd made the mistake of coming here. "Nothing ever happens here," he said, his voice flat and monotonous. "Not a tourist place, never has been, never will be. People just live off what they grow in their fields and their gardens. Corn mostly, some beans, a few vegetables if the soil cooperates. Sometimes folks from the city come wanting to take pictures or ask questions about our traditions, about how we live. People don't like that. Don't like being treated like museum exhibits or curiosities. Don't like being recorded or written about or pulled into other people's stories and agendas. I'm not here for that," Diego said, which was technically true even if it was also a lie. "I just want to understand what life is like here. Maybe talk to a few people about their experiences. Nothing intrusive." The man gave a short laugh that sounded more like a cough, like something he was trying to suppress, but couldn't quite contain. "And if there's nothing to understand, if it's just a place where people are born and live and die without anything interesting ever happening, what will you do then?" Diego didn't have an answer for that question, so he said nothing. At one point, the street forked, creating a Y intersection where Diego had to choose which direction to follow. He could see quite clearly that one path was shorter, more direct toward where a building with a distinctive rust-colored roof sat on a small rise. Probably the old mill the woman in the tienda had mentioned, which meant Rosa's house would be nearby. But his guide took the other route without hesitation, the long way around that would add at least 10 minutes to their walk. Diego noticed this but said nothing, understanding on some instinctive level that questioning the choice would be a mistake. It felt deliberate, calculated, like the man was making absolutely sure Diego didn't see something specific, like there was a particular street or building or scene that needed to be avoided at all costs. They walked past a small church with its doors chained shut. Thick chains wrapped multiple times through the handles and secured with a padlock the size of Diego's fist. The windows were broken, the glass long gone, leaving just jagged edges in the frames. Weeds grew tall around the foundation, reaching up toward the broken windows as if trying to reclaim the building for nature. No one had maintained this church in years, maybe decades. Past the church, they walked by a well with a stone rim that looked centuries old, the stones worn smooth by countless hands drawing water, though the well appeared abandoned now, a wooden cover nailed across the top and marked with faded red paint that might have been a warning or might have been graffiti. Past houses that might have been occupied or might have been abandoned, it was genuinely impossible to tell, with all the windows covered with no smoke from cooking fires, with no sounds of life or activity of any kind. Finally, at 11:05 a.m., they arrived at a simple house with whitewashed walls that were peeling and cracked, the paint job clearly many years old. A large hammock hung on the covered porch, swaying slightly in a breeze that Diego couldn't feel on his own skin. The man called out without approaching the door, keeping his distance, as if invisible boundaries existed that he wasn't allowed to cross. A thin woman in her mid-60s emerged from the darkness of the interior, stepping out onto the porch slowly, as if her joints hurt, or as if she was being very careful about something. Her hair was pulled back so tight Diego could see the tension in her scalp, every hair scraped back and secured in a bun that looked painful. A dark rebozo draped over her shoulders despite the brutal heat, the heavy fabric seeming like it would be unbearable in this temperature. "He needs a room," the man said without preamble, without introduction or explanation, as if Senora Rosa would understand everything from that simple statement. Rosa looked Diego over with that same assessing gaze. Everyone in this village seemed to have mastered that look that stripped away pretense and saw exactly who you were and what you were worth. After a long moment that stretched uncomfortably, she nodded once sharply. "Payment in advance, 500 pesos per night, and no noise after dark. Those are the rules. If you can't follow the rules, don't bother asking for a room." Diego agreed immediately, so relieved to have found shelter that he didn't even think about negotiating or questioning the price, which was easily twice what a room should cost even in a tourist area, and this was definitely not a tourist area. He paid her 500 pesos more than most families in this village probably saw in a week, counting out the bills carefully while she watched. Rosa took the money and shoved it into a pocket of her dress, without counting, without verifying the amount, just as the woman in the tienda had done, as if the money itself was meaningless, as if they were all testing something else entirely, and the transaction was just a formality. Then she gestured curtly for him to follow, turning and walking back into the house without checking to see if he obeyed. She led him through a dim hallway that smelled powerfully of mildew and old cooking oil, and something else Diego couldn't identify, something organic and slightly rotten. The walls were stained with water damage, patterns of brown and yellow that looked almost like maps of countries that didn't exist. Then she opened a door to reveal a small back room that looked like it hadn't been occupied in years. Inside was a metal bed frame with a thin mattress that sagged in the middle, an old fan in the corner that looked like it hadn't worked since the previous century, and a damp curtain covering a single small window, the fabric so thin Diego could see daylight through it, but couldn't make out any details of what was outside. The walls were bare concrete, unpainted, stained with more water damage and what might have been mold growing in the upper corners. "Bathroom is down that hall, second door on the left. No electricity between 6 p.m. and 6 a.m. Those are the hours we have power. Nothing I can do about it. That's just how it is here." Her voice was completely flat, emotionless, delivering information without any expectation that Diego might object or negotiate. As Diego set down his backpack on the questionable mattress, hearing the springs creak ominously under even that small weight, he decided to take the chance to ask the question that had brought him here in the first place. "Do you know a woman named Elena Vargas? She would be from this village, probably lives here or lived here recently." Senora Rosa froze mid-step, her entire body going rigid as if she'd been turned to stone. For just a second, maybe two, her carefully blank expression cracked completely, showing something underneath fear. Definitely fear, but also anger and something else Diego couldn't name, something complicated and dark. Her eyes narrowed to slits and her jaw clenched so hard Diego could see the muscles jumping. "No," she said, but the word came out too fast, too sharp, too defensive to be believable. It was the answer of someone who absolutely knew the name and didn't want to talk about it. "Are you sure? Because I received—" "There are many Elenas in the world," Rosa interrupted, her voice rising slightly, losing some of that flat, emotionless quality. "Many Vargas families. Maybe you have the wrong village. Maybe you should check somewhere else, somewhere that isn't here." She turned and walked out without waiting for a response, her footsteps quick and hard on the concrete floor, almost running, as if she couldn't get away from Diego and his questions fast enough. Diego sat on the bed, which groaned alarmingly under his weight, and the mattress was even more uncomfortable than it looked lumpy. and smelling of dust and old sweat and time. Through the thin curtain he could see the sun still high in the sky, could feel the heat radiating through the single-pane window. According to his watch, it was only 11:15 a.m. on Saturday. 7 hours and 45 minutes until the combi would return at 7 p.m. to take him away from this place. It felt like an eternity, like a prison sentence he'd somehow volunteered for. He pulled out his phone, knowing what he'd find, but checking anyway, hoping against hope. No signal, not even one bar, not even a whisper of connectivity. He'd expected that the village was too remote, too isolated, too far from any cell tower. But seeing that empty signal indicator, that absolute confirmation that he was cut off from the world he knew, still made his chest tighten with anxiety that bordered on panic. Diego lay back on the bed, staring at the water-stained ceiling where patterns in the damage looked almost like faces, if you stared at them long enough, almost like skulls screaming silently. Through the thin walls, he could hear nothing, no voices, no footsteps, no signs of life at all. Just that constant drone of flies that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, that seemed to exist inside his head as much as outside it. He told himself he'd rest for just an hour, would let his body recover from the brutal journey and the oppressive heat, and then he'd go out and explore the village, ask more questions, try to find out what had happened to Elena Vargas. The heat and exhaustion from the journey pulled him under, almost immediately dragging him down into a sleep that was more like unconsciousness, dark and dreamless and absolute. When Diego woke, everything had changed. The light coming through the thin curtain had shifted dramatically, was now orange and low-angled, rather than the harsh white of midday sun. He sat up quickly, his heart immediately racing, and checked his watch with hands that were already starting to shake. 6:45 p.m. on Saturday evening. He'd slept for over 7 hours, had lost almost the entire day to sleep, and the combi was scheduled to leave in 15 minutes. Diego grabbed his backpack in a panic, not bothering to check if he'd left anything in the room, not caring about anything except getting to that combi before it left without him. He rushed down the hallway toward the front of the house, his footsteps echoing in the empty space, his breath coming fast and shallow. But when he reached the door that should have led outside, that should have led to freedom and escape, he stopped. Cold stopped, so suddenly he almost fell forward from momentum. Heavy chains secured the door from the inside. Thick links of metal, the kind you'd use to secure a gate or lock up valuable equipment, wrapped multiple times through the door handles and held in place by a padlock the size of Diego's fist, solid and heavy and completely immovable without a key. He tried the handle anyway, pulling hard, putting his full weight into it, desperation giving him strength. The chains rattled loudly in the silence, but held firm, didn't even strain, didn't give a millimeter. No one goes out after 8 o'clock in the evening. That's one of the rules. Diego spun around, his heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. Señora Rosa stood in the kitchen doorway, 10 feet away, illuminated by a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling behind her, the harsh light creating stark shadows that made her look ancient, skeletal, barely human. "But it's not even 7 yet," Diego protested, hearing the panic in his own voice, not caring that he sounded desperate and afraid. "I need to catch the combi. The driver said 7 p.m. and I have to—" "The rule is 8, Rosa said, her voice flat and emotionless again, delivering information without any acknowledgement of Diego's distress. "But it's better to be earlier than that. Much better. Much safer. The chains go on at 6:30 every evening, and they don't come off until 6:30 every morning. That's how we survive here." "I don't understand. I need to leave. I have to get back to the city. I have people waiting for me, people who will worry if I don't." "If you're hungry, I can make you something to eat. If you're thirsty, there's water. But the chains don't come off. Not for anyone. Not for any reason." Diego wanted to argue, wanted to demand she unlock the door immediately, wanted to threaten or bribe or do whatever it took to get out of this house and back to that road where the combi would be waiting. But something in her expression stopped him. Something in the absolute flatness of her affect that suggested argument would be useless. It wasn't hostility exactly. It was more like resignation, like she was following rules she hadn't made and couldn't break, even if she wanted to. Like she was as much a prisoner of this place as he was. "I need to eat," he said quietly, accepting defeat, because what else could he do? He couldn't break those chains, couldn't break down a door, couldn't overpower this woman and take the key if she even had it. He was trapped at least until morning, and fighting against that reality would accomplish nothing. Rosa nodded and turned toward the kitchen without another word. Diego followed his mind, racing, trying to understand what was happening, trying to figure out why a village would chain its residents inside after dark, what they were afraid of or trying to keep out. He'd missed the combi, the only way out. The driver had said it was the only trip back today, which meant tomorrow, Sunday, June 14th, there'd be another one. He'd just have to stay one night, endure whatever strangeness this place held for one night, and then in the morning he'd catch the first ride out and never look back. One night. He could survive one night anywhere. The kitchen was small and cramped, dominated by an old gas stove that looked like it dated from the 1970s, and a refrigerator that hummed so loudly it was almost a roar, the sound filling the entire room. Rosa gestured for Diego to sit at a wooden table that was scarred with years of knife marks and burns and stains, a piece of furniture that had seen decades of use and abuse. The chairs didn't match, were different heights and styles, as if they'd been collected one at a time over many years. Rosa opened the refrigerator at 7:05 p.m., and what happened next would be seared into Diego's memory forever. The sound hit him first, a deep, wet buzzing that was nothing like the mechanical hum of a refrigerator compressor. Not mechanical at all. Organic. Alive. The sound of thousands of living things all moving at once, all breathing and existing and hungry. Then the flies poured out, not a few dozen, not even hundreds, but what had to be thousands of them, streaming into the kitchen like smoke from a fire, like water from a broken dam, filling the air with their bodies and their terrible buzzing. They touched Diego everywhere, his neck, his hands, his hair, his face, his ears crawling and landing and walking with tiny legs that felt like needles. He squeezed his eyes shut instinctively, fighting with every ounce of willpower not to scream, not to run, not to claw at his own skin where he could feel them walking. His teeth clenched so hard, his jaw ached so hard, he thought his molars might crack from the pressure. "Damn flies," he managed to mutter through clenched teeth, swatting frantically at his face and neck, trying to drive them away, but only managing to kill a few their bodies, leaving smears of something dark on his skin. Senora Rosa turned toward him slowly. So slowly it seemed deliberate, theatrical. She let the refrigerator door swing shut behind her, the movement casual, unhurried. The flies continued swarming, continued landing on every exposed surface, but she didn't seem to notice or care. "Did you come for the flies?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, but somehow cutting through the buzzing. "Or for the witches? What is it that brought you to this place where you don't belong?" The buzzing didn't stop when she asked the question. If anything, it grew louder, grew more intense, changing pitch in a way that suggested intelligence, purpose, as if the flies had understood the question and were waiting to hear Diego's answer, as if they cared what brought this stranger to their territory. Diego pulled his notebook from his back pocket with hands that shook so badly he almost dropped it. His journalist training kicking in despite his fear and confusion. Document everything. Ask questions even when you don't want to know the answers. Get information even when the information terrifies you. When did the flies start? His voice came out steadier than he'd expected, came out almost professional, as if he were interviewing a source for a normal story about normal things. When did you first notice them in these numbers? Rosa set a glass of water on the table in front of him. The liquid slightly cloudy, possibly not safe to drink, but Diego's throat was so dry he didn't care. Without looking directly at him, without meeting his eyes, she answered in that same flat voice. The flies came when the witches came. They always come together. You can't have one without the other. Where witches gather, flies follow. It's always been that way since the beginning of time. Diego wrote down the phrase exactly as she'd said it, though his hand trembled so much the writing came out shaky and barely legible letters overlapping and running together. For the first time since beginning this journey, since reading Elena Vargas's email in his father's study, a thought crystallized in his mind with terrible clarity. What if the witch hunt wasn't a metaphor at all? What if it wasn't about persecution or scapegoating or patriarchy? What if he was going to encounter something that couldn't be explained by sociology or anthropology or rational thought? What if witches were real? Rosa served him a plate with something that looked approximately like meat in a dark brown sauce. Though the meat was an odd texture and an odd color, nothing Diego could identify from appearance alone. The smell was unfamiliar, gamey and strong and slightly rotten, with an underlying tang that made his stomach turn. But he was hungry enough that the nausea didn't matter, hungry enough that he picked up his fork and started eating, forcing the food down because his body needed fuel even if his mind was screaming at him to stop. The meat was tough, requiring significant chewing before it would break down enough to swallow. The sauce was bitter, and coating left a film on his teeth and tongue that tasted of old grease and something metallic like blood or iron. Diego forced himself to swallow, washing each bite down with the cloudy water that tasted of minerals and rust and possibly contamination. He was halfway through the plate, his jaw aching from chewing, when he bit into something that was definitely not meat. The texture was wrong, composite, crunchy, like dozens or hundreds of tiny pieces compressed together into a larger mass, like something that had once been many small things and had been assembled or fused into one. When his teeth came together on it, when he bit down hard enough to try to break through it, the sound was unmistakable, was exactly the same sound he'd heard when the old woman on the path had closed her mouth on that fly. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The sound of exoskeletons, breaking of bodies, being crushed, of insects dying between his molars. Diego stopped chewing immediately, stopped moving entirely, every muscle in his body going rigid with horror and revulsion. He looked down at his plate, at the food he'd been eating, at the dark sauce that suddenly looked less like gravy and more like something else entirely. Then he looked up at Rosa, his eyes asking the question his mouth couldn't form. She was watching him with an expression that might have been pity or might have been satisfaction, or might have been something else entirely that Diego had no frame of reference to understand. "You'll get used to the flies," Rosa said softly, and for the first time there was something almost like emotion in her voice, something almost like sympathy. "But only after you leave, only after you escape this place and go back to where you came from. And even then you'll never really be free of them. They'll follow you in your dreams." Diego forced himself to swallow whatever was in his mouth without examining it further, without thinking about what it might be, because thinking about it would make him vomit, and he couldn't afford to lose what little nutrition he'd just ingested. He drank the entire glass of cloudy water in one continuous gulp, the liquid doing nothing to wash away the taste, doing nothing to cleanse the feeling of contamination that was spreading through his body like poison. Before he could say anything, before he could ask what she meant or demand to know what he'd just eaten, Rosa continued in that same soft voice, "Your face reminds me of someone. I can't quite place it, but you look familiar. Not like someone from here. Like someone I saw in a newspaper or on television, maybe. Someone important." Diego felt heat rise to his cheeks, despite everything else, felt embarrassment cutting through his fear and disgust. People said that often he looked too much like his father, shared too many of Don Roberto's distinctive features. But some instinct told him that revealing his parentage here would be catastrophically dangerous, would change something fundamental about how these people saw him and treated him. "I get that a lot," he said non-committally, keeping his voice neutral, offering nothing. "I just have one of those faces, I guess. common features. Rosa dried her hands on her apron with slow, methodical movements, each swipe deliberate and precise, as if she were performing some kind of ritual rather than just wiping away water. Then she made a decision, came to some conclusion Diego couldn't read. "Come," she said finally, after a long pause. "I want to show you something. Something you should see before tomorrow, before you try to leave." She removed the chains from the front door with practiced efficiency, the metal clinking softly as she unwrapped them, as she pulled the padlock through and set it aside. The ease with which she handled them, the practiced nature of her movements, suggested she did this every evening and every morning, that this ritual was as much a part of her life as breathing. Then she stepped outside into the evening air at 7:40 p.m., and Diego hesitated for only a moment before following his curiosity, overriding his fear, his need to understand overriding his survival instinct. The night air was heavy and thick, not cooler than the interior of the house, but somehow more oppressive, as if the darkness itself had physical weight. It carried a smell Diego had noticed vaguely since arriving, but hadn't been able to identify until now, until this moment when it was strong enough to force identification. Burnt wood, but not the pleasant smell of a campfire. Cooked meat, but not the appetizing smell of a barbecue. Something else underneath it all, the sweet, sick smell of decay, of rot, of death that had been left in the sun too long. They walked in silence toward the village center, their footsteps loud in the absolute quiet. There were no streetlights, no lights visible in any windows, no sounds of life from the houses they passed, just the rustling of wind through unseen trees and the ever-present buzz of flies, somehow even louder in the darkness, as if night was their true domain, as if they only pretended to be normal insects during daylight hours. "Do you hear them?" Rosa asked, without turning around, without slowing her pace. "They never sleep, never rest. They're always hungry, always searching, always waiting. That's what makes them perfect servants. That's why he chose them." Diego wanted to ask who he was, but something told him he'd find out soon enough that Rosa was taking him to see something that would answer all his questions and give him 1,000 new ones. His eyes slowly adjusted to the darkness, as they walked adjusted enough to make out shapes and shadows and basic features of the landscape. Ahead he could see an open space, the plaza he'd noticed when first entering the village that morning, though that morning felt like it had happened in another lifetime to a different person. In the moonlight, filtering through thin clouds, he could see the shapes of trees, their branches spreading against the star-filled sky like skeletal fingers reaching toward heaven, or maybe grasping for something they could never quite touch. Then he saw what hung from those trees, and every thought in his mind simply stopped. At first, Diego's brain simply refused to process what his eyes were showing him. The shapes were wrong. The context was impossible. And his rational mind kept trying to reinterpret the data into something that made sense, something that fit into the world as he understood it. But as they got closer, as more details emerged from the shadows and moonlight, as his eyes adjusted fully to the darkness, understanding crashed over him like a wave of ice water, like a physical blow that knocked the breath from his lungs. In the center of the plaza stood a massive tree, ancient beyond measure, its trunk so thick that 3 or 4 men holding hands couldn't have wrapped their arms around it. The bark was dark and gnarled, twisted in ways that suggested great age and suffering, as if the tree itself had been warped by what it had witnessed, by what it had been forced to hold. Beneath the tree, a circular patch of scorched earth marked where a bonfire had burned recently, the ground still black with ash and soot, and the residue of whatever fuel had been used. The circle was perfect, too perfect to be accidental, marked out with deliberate precision. And from one of the thick branches that spread out from the trunk like arms offering a grotesque embrace, a body hung by a rope around its neck. A woman. That much was clear even from a distance. Her hair moved slightly in the breeze, long and dark and matted with what looked like dried blood and ash hanging down past her shoulders to brush against her chest. Her clothes were burned, hanging in charred tatters from her frame, pieces of fabric that might once have been a dress, but were now just ribbons of blackened cloth. The rope around her neck was thick, professionally tied, the kind of noose that spoke of experience and deliberation rather than hasty anger. The rope creaked softly as the body swayed in the gentle wind, a sound like a door opening slowly in an empty house, a sound that seemed to carry across the entire plaza, despite how quiet it was. But it was her face that made Diego's breath stop in his lungs, that made his heart skip several beats before resuming at a racing pace that made him dizzy. She was smiling, not a natural smile, not the kind of expression any living or recently deceased person could make. The mouth was stretched too wide, pulled back to show teeth and gums in a grimace that was anatomically impossible, that required muscles to contract in ways they simply couldn't. The lips were drawn back so far they'd split at the corners, creating wounds that should have bled but appeared dried and dark. And her eyes, dear God, her eyes were open. Not half open in the way that sometimes happens with the dead, not glazed or rolled back, but wide open and staring straight ahead with an expression of such profound wrongness that Diego felt his knees weaken, felt his bladder threaten to release, felt every primitive instinct in his body screaming at him to run, to get away, to put as much distance as possible between himself and this thing that looked human but couldn't possibly be. The flies covered her almost completely, creating a moving blanket of black bodies that pulsed and shifted with collective rhythm, thousands or tens of thousands of insects working in strange coordination. But through gaps in the swarm, through moments when the flies shifted position, Diego could see her eyes clearly, and those eyes were tracking movement, following him as he stood there staring. The pupils were still there, still dark, still focused, doing things that eyes 3 days dead should not be able to do. "That's where they burn them," Rosa said quietly beside him, her voice barely above a whisper, but somehow cutting through Diego's shock. "In that circle beneath the tree. That's where we confirm what they are, where the fire reveals their true nature. And that's where we hang them afterward, where the rope keeps them from coming back, from returning to finish what they started. The fire confirms, the rope contains." Diego couldn't speak, couldn't move. His entire body had gone numb, his brain unable to process the sensory input it was receiving, unable to reconcile what he was seeing with anything in his experience or understanding. "Who?" He finally managed, his voice coming out as a croak, barely recognizable as his own. "Who was she? What was her name?" "Elena Vargas," Rosa said, and the name hung in the air between them like a physical thing, like a weight Diego could feel pressing down on his chest. "The woman who sent the email. The woman who had begged for help, who had reached out to his father with a desperate plea that had gone unanswered. She was here, had been here the whole time, dead, hanging from this tree while flies used her body as a feeding ground, as a nest, as something Diego didn't want to think about. "How long?" Diego whispered. "How long has she been?" 3 days and 4 nights, Rosa answered. "Since Wednesday evening. We'll leave her until she dries completely, until her face settles, and we're absolutely certain we have the right one, that she didn't steal someone else's identity at the last moment. It takes time. Sometimes a week. Sometimes more. You can't leave a body hanging. There are laws, there are authorities, We tried to take them down," Rosa interrupted. And for the first time, Diego heard actual emotion in her voice, something that might have been fear, or might have been despair, or might have been both. "The first ones. The ones that came before Elena. We tried to be civilized about it, tried to give them proper burials after the burning. But the ropes tighten on their own when you touch them. They contract like living things, like snakes. The men who tried to climb up and cut them down got sick. Flies poured from their eyes and their noses and their mouths, so many flies. It seemed impossible that a human body could contain them all. Their skin opened from the inside, splitting along invisible seams, as if something was trying to get out or get in. 2 men died that way. We don't try anymore. Diego forced himself to look away from Elena's body, to tear his gaze away from those impossible eyes and that impossible smile. He scanned the rest of the plaza, and that's when he realized the full scope of the horror, when he understood that what he was seeing was so much worse than he'd initially comprehended. It wasn't just one tree. Every tree in the plaza, and he counted quickly, 5, 6, 7, 8 of them, had ropes hanging from their branches, and from each rope hung a body, hung a woman, hung someone's daughter or sister or mother or wife. Some were fresh enough that he could still see their features clearly, could see the humanity in their faces even twisted by death, and that impossible smile. Others were further along in decomposition, skin blackening and pulling tight over skulls, bones starting to show through in places. A few were little more than skeletons, held together by dried sinew and scraps of clothing, empty eye sockets, somehow still seeming to watch, still seeming to see. At the base of each tree, placed with obvious care, were shoes. Pairs of shoes arranged neatly side by side, as if their owners had simply stepped out of them before ascending into the branches, as if they'd been invited to some aerial gathering and had politely removed their footwear before attending. The shoes were all different: sandals and flats and sneakers and boots. Cheap shoes worn down by poverty and labor, each pair a tiny biography of someone's life. Diego started counting his lips, moving silently, his finger twitching as he pointed at each pair. He lost track, started again. His mind couldn't hold the number, kept slipping away from the terrible arithmetic of death. 20 pairs of shoes, maybe 22, maybe more. Some were partially hidden by weeds and shadows. 20 bodies, 20 women, 20 people hanging in these trees like grotesque fruit, like warnings, like offerings to something Diego didn't want to name. "My God," Diego whispered, and the words felt inadequate, felt like nothing in the face of this enormity. "My God, what is this place? What happened here?" "God has nothing to do with this place," Rosa said flatly, her voice returning to that emotionless monotone. "Not anymore. Not for a long time. Maybe never. This is the domain of something else now, something older than your God, something that doesn't care about your prayers or your laws or your understanding of how the world should work." Diego's hand went automatically to his phone muscle memory from his journalism training, overriding his shock. Document everything, take photos, create evidence, build a case. But when he pulled the device from his pocket and tried to turn it on, the screen remained black. The battery had been nearly full when he'd checked it that morning. He specifically remembered looking at it on the combi ride, seeing it at 87%. Now it was completely dead, wouldn't respond to any button press, as if something had drained every electron of charge while it sat in his pocket. Of course it was dead. Nothing in this place worked the way it should. "We should go back," Rosa said, already turning away from the plaza. "They don't like to be watched at night. During the day they tolerate observers, but after dark they become agitated, aggressive. It's not safe to stand here looking at them when they can look back." You keep saying they. You mean the women? The bodies?" Rosa didn't answer, was already walking back toward her house with that same measured pace, not hurrying, but not dawdling either, as if she knew exactly how much time they had before something changed, before some invisible boundary was crossed. Diego looked up one more time at Elena's body, at the woman who had reached out for help and received none, who had been failed by his father and by extension by him, at her impossible smile and her watching eyes. And as he stood there, as the seconds stretched into what felt like minutes, he heard something that made every hair on his body stand up. A low creaking sound. Not the rope swaying in the wind. Something else. The sound of wood under tension, like a branch bending under too much weight, even though the weight hadn't changed. The sound came from his left, from one of the other trees, And when Diego turned his head to look, he saw exactly what he'd been afraid he'd see. One of the other bodies was moving, not swaying randomly in the wind, not shifting passively, moving deliberately, rotating, turning slowly on its rope to face the direction Diego was walking, turning with clear purpose and intention as if it wanted to watch him leave, as if it wanted to see where he went, as if it needed to keep him in its field of vision for reasons Diego absolutely did not want to understand. He didn't look back again. He ran after Rosa, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst, his breath coming in short gasps that didn't seem to deliver enough oxygen. Behind him he heard more creaking, more of that terrible sound of bodies turning on ropes, of dead things moving with purpose, of impossibilities manifesting in the darkness. All of them turning, all of them watching. All 20 or more pairs of eyes tracking his retreat across the plaza. Back in Senora Rosa's house at 8:20 p.m. on Saturday night, Diego climbed the stairs to his room on legs that felt like water, like they might give out at any moment and send him tumbling back down. He pushed the metal bed frame against the door. It wasn't much, probably wouldn't stop anyone who really wanted to get in, but it made him feel slightly safer, gave him the illusion of control in a situation where he had none. Then he sat on the floor with his back against the wall, hugging his knees to his chest, trying to process what he'd just seen, trying to make sense of something that made no sense at all. This wasn't what he'd expected to find when he read Elena's email. He'd imagined witnessing injustice, frightened villagers caught up in superstition and mob mentality, innocent women being scapegoated for problems they didn't cause, the kind of thing that happened depressingly often in isolated communities where education was poor and old beliefs died hard. He'd planned to document it with his phone and his notebook, to expose it with articles and maybe a short documentary, to use the power of journalism to stop it and bring the perpetrators to justice and save lives. But this was something else entirely, something that made his rational, educated 21st century mind rebel against what his eyes had seen and what his instincts knew to be true. Those women hanging in the trees, the way their eyes moved, the way their bodies rotated to watch him, the way they smiled with mouths stretched far beyond normal human capability, that wasn't the result of mob mentality or religious fervor or ordinary human evil. That was something older, something that shouldn't exist in the modern world, but clearly did, something that had probably always existed in the dark corners and forgotten places where light and reason and civilization couldn't quite reach. Diego didn't sleep that night, didn't even try. Every time he closed his eyes for more than a few seconds, he saw Elena's smile, heard the creak of ropes, felt phantom flies walking across his skin. The sounds from outside the house didn't help. His state of mind didn't do anything to calm his racing thoughts or slow his hammering heart. Around midnight he heard footsteps shuffling past the house, slow and dragging, as if someone was walking with great difficulty or with feet that barely touched the ground, that only made contact with the earth intermittently. A short, sharp scream cut through the night air, a sound of pure terror that lasted maybe 2 seconds before being choked off, abruptly cut short as if someone had literally grabbed the screamer's throat and squeezed. Worst of all was the child, a child crying desperately somewhere not too far away, crying with the kind of hopeless despair that suggested they knew help wasn't coming, that no one was going to respond, no matter how loudly they wailed. The crying went on for several minutes, getting more and more frantic, and then stopped so suddenly, so completely, that the silence afterward was somehow worse than the sound had been suggested. Something terrible had happened, some final solution to the child's distress that Diego didn't want to imagine. And always underneath everything else, constant and eternal, the buzzing. The sound of flies that never slept, never rested, never stopped their work. As if night was when they were most active, most engaged with whatever purpose drove them. Around 3 a.m. on Sunday morning, Diego heard something that made his blood freeze in his veins despite the heat. Footsteps on the stairs inside the house. Slow, methodical, deliberate. each step separated by exactly 3 seconds, as if whoever was climbing was counting between each movement as if they were savoring the approach. 1, 2, 3. A footfall that made the old wood creak. 1, 2, 3. Another step closer. Diego stood up slowly, trying not to make any noise, trying not to breathe too loudly, and pressed himself against the wall beside the door where he'd be hidden if someone looked in through the crack. His heart was beating so hard, he was sure whoever was in the hallway could hear it, could track him by the sound of his own terrified cardiovascular system. The footsteps stopped right outside his door. Right on the other side of the thin wood that separated Diego from whatever was standing there. 5 seconds passed. Diego counted them, needed something to focus on to keep from screaming. 10 seconds, 15, 20. Then Diego heard it, a soft sound, quiet but distinct, like someone pressing their face close to the crack beneath the door, getting down on hands and knees to do so, then inhaling deeply, deliberately, as if trying to catch a scent, as if smelling the room to determine what or who was inside. The inhalation went on for impossibly long, far longer than human lungs should be able to sustain. 5 seconds, 10 seconds more. Diego held his breath without consciously deciding, to some survival instinct overriding his autonomic nervous system, telling his body to be as still and quiet as possible, to pretend to be a rock or a piece of furniture or anything except a living, breathing target. Another 10 seconds of that terrible silence, that pregnant pause that felt like it might stretch into eternity. Then the footsteps resumed descending the stairs with that same measured 3-second interval, whoever or whatever it was, apparently satisfied with whatever they'd smelled or sensed, or determined, leaving Diego alone for now, filing him away for later consideration. Diego stayed frozen against the wall for another full hour, not daring to move, barely daring to breathe, listening with every fiber of his being for any sound that might indicate the thing was returning. When the first gray light of dawn finally began to creep through the thin curtain at 6 a.m. on Sunday morning, when that darkness started to lift even slightly, Diego finally allowed himself to slide down the wall and sit on the floor, his legs giving out, his entire body shaking with exhaustion and terror and adrenaline crash. He was alive. He'd survived the night. And in just a few hours, the combi would return. Surely it would return. Surely the driver wouldn't abandon him here, and he could leave this nightmare behind, could go back to Mexico City and his comfortable life and pretend this had all been a bad dream brought on by heat stroke or contaminated food or stress. But first, he had to make it through the morning, had to last just a few more hours. Diego grabbed his backpack at 6:30 a.m., and crept down the stairs as quietly as possible, desperate not to wake anyone, desperate not to have any more conversations with Senora Rosa or anyone else in this cursed place. The front door's chains were already removed. Apparently Rosa was an early riser, and had already done her morning ritual of freeing the household from its nightly prison. Rosa herself was nowhere to be seen, not in the kitchen or the living room or anywhere Diego could detect. He pushed through the door and ran, not caring about dignity or appearing calm, just needing to get away from that house and everything it represented. His backpack bounced painfully against his spine, and his lungs burned in the already warming air, but he didn't slow down until he reached the road where the combi had dropped him off yesterday morning. Had it really only been yesterday? It felt like weeks had passed, like he'd aged years in a single day and night. Diego collapsed in the dirt at 7:15 a.m. on Sunday morning, gasping for breath, his shirt soaked with sweat, and prepared to wait. The combi was scheduled to come at 9 a.m., according to what the driver had said originally, 7 p.m. going back. But surely there was a morning run as well. Surely this village couldn't be completely cut off from the world. Surely someone delivered supplies or transported people or maintained some connection to normal civilization. And he waited. 1 hour passed. The sun climbed higher and the heat began to build toward the oppressive levels it had reached yesterday. 2 hours. Diego drank the last of his water, the bottle that had been in his pack, and immediately regretted it because now he had nothing left and no idea when he'd next have access to any. 3 hours. The sun was approaching its zenith, and Diego was starting to feel genuinely worried about heat stroke, about dehydration, about his body's ability to cope with these conditions without shade or water or any relief. At 10:30 a.m. on Sunday morning, Diego saw a man approaching from the direction of the village, walking slowly and carrying a burlap sack slung over one shoulder. Hope surged in Diego's chest. Here was someone to ask someone who could tell him when the combi ran on Sundays, whether he'd missed it or whether it was yet to come. Diego called out to him as soon as he was close enough to hear. "Excuse me, por favor, señor." "Do you know what time the combi comes through here on Sundays? When should I expect it?" The man stopped walking and looked at Diego with an expression that was equal parts pity and contempt, the look you might give a child who's just asked a stupid question, who clearly doesn't understand how the world works. "Not today," the man said flatly. "Sunday. Route doesn't run on Sundays. Driver takes the day off. Everyone knows that." The words took a moment to sink in, to penetrate through Diego's heat-fogged brain and register their full meaning. "But someone told me yesterday it would come at 7 p.m., they said." "They told you wrong," the man interrupted, shifting the sack to his other shoulder. "Or maybe they told you exactly what they wanted you to hear. Maybe they needed you to stay. Maybe you're part of something you don't understand yet." He started walking again, heading down toward the main road, then called back over his shoulder without turning around or slowing his pace. "Next combi comes Monday morning, 6 a.m., if you can last that long." Diego stood alone on the road at 10:35 a.m., the realization settling over him like a shroud. The walk to the nearest town would take 7 hours, maybe 8 based on how long the combi ride had been. In this heat, in his current condition, without water or proper supplies, attempting that walk would be suicide. He'd collapse from heat exhaustion or dehydration. Within the first hour or two would die alone on some dirt road with flies feeding on his corpse before anyone even knew he was missing. He had no choice, none at all. He turned and began walking back toward the village at 11 a.m. on Sunday, June 14th, each step feeling like a descent into hell. Each meter back toward that place, feeling like he was walking away from salvation and toward something dark and hungry that had been waiting patiently for him to give up his attempts at escape. Diego wandered the empty streets for hours on Sunday afternoon, the sun beating down mercilessly, his mouth dry as dust, his head pounding with the beginnings of dehydration. Every house seemed to be watching him through closed shutters and covered windows, seemed to be aware of his presence, and his failure to escape seemed almost amused by his predicament. Every shadow felt alive with malevolent attention. He was trapped here for at least another night, for another sunset and another darkness, and the thought of enduring what he'd endured last night again, of hearing those footsteps on the stairs again, made him want to scream or cry or both. Around 3 p.m., exhaustion and desperate thirst drove him back toward the commercial area, toward the only part of the village that seemed to have any connection to the outside world. The tienda where he'd first stopped was closed now, metal shutters pulled down and padlocked, despite it being mid-afternoon on what should be a normal business day. But further down the dusty road he noticed for the first time a shop he'd somehow missed on his first pass through the village. Smaller than the tienda, its windows displaying religious figurines and candles and keychains and old photographs in faded frames, the kind of stuff you'd find in any tourist shop in any Mexican village. Above the entrance, barely legible in hand-painted letters that were peeling and faded, Diego read, "Regalos Vargas," gifts, Vargas, the same last name as Elena. Diego stood outside for a full 5 minutes at 3:15 p.m. on Sunday afternoon, his heart pounding for reasons that had nothing to do with heat or dehydration. Every instinct he possessed screamed at him to walk away, to leave this place alone, to not open this particular door or ask these particular questions. But he'd come all this way. He'd endured everything he'd endured. He couldn't leave without understanding at least some of what had happened here, without getting at least some of the answers he'd traveled so far to find. He pushed open the door and stepped inside. The interior smelled of plastic and candle wax and something else, something sweet and cloying and organic, like flowers left in stagnant water for too long, like perfume trying to cover the smell of decay. Behind a cluttered counter displaying crucifixes and rosaries and images of various saints stood a thin man in his mid-50s with hollow eyes and a jaw clenched so tight Diego could see the muscles jumping beneath his skin. His hair was gray but still thick, combed back from his forehead. His clothes were clean but old, worn, threadbare in places from many washings. He looked like he'd once been a solid man, well-fed and strong, but grief had worn him down to the essential framework. "Good afternoon," Diego said, his voice coming out rough and cracked from lack of water. "I'm looking for Elena Vargas. I received a message from her and She doesn't live here," the man interrupted immediately, his voice flat, but his hands gripping the edge of the counter so hard his knuckles went white. Diego moved toward the door, ready to leave and abandon this whole cursed endeavor. But the man's voice stopped him before he'd taken 2 steps. "She doesn't live anywhere anymore. You saw her." "I know you saw her. Everyone who comes here sees her. That's why they hang her where they hang her, so everyone can see what happened, so everyone can understand." Diego turned back slowly, carefully, like you might turn to face a wounded animal that could still be dangerous. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. She was my daughter." The words came out broken, catching in the man's throat, and Diego saw tears gathering in his eyes, saw them spill over and run down his weathered cheeks without being wiped away. "Elena was my daughter, my oldest child, my baby girl, and I watched them burn her and hang her from that tree, and there was nothing I could do, nothing any of us could do, because she wasn't Elena anymore, not at the end, not when they took her." Diego struggled to breathe, struggled to process this, struggled to find words that meant anything in the face of this man's grief. "What happened to her? Who did this? When did—" The man looked down at his wristwatch, an old mechanical one that looked like it might have been his father's or grandfather's. Then, up at the wall clock, one of those old round ones with golden numbers and a second hand that ticked loudly in the silence of the shop, each tick seeming to echo in the small space. "You missed the combi again?" the man said, and there was something in his voice that might have been sympathy, or might have been something else, something darker. "They lied to you about the schedule, about when it runs and when it doesn't. They do that sometimes, when they need someone to stay." "What? No. I was told the route doesn't run on." "You were lied to," the man said simply, and the certainty in his voice was chilling. "It ran this morning, 6:30 a.m., just like it does every morning, including Sundays. I watched it pass by my window while I was having coffee. It's the only way to leave here." "And they made absolutely sure you'd miss it. They've been making sure of things since the moment you arrived." Silence stretched between them, heavy and oppressive, filled with the ticking of that wall clock and the distant buzzing of flies that never seemed to stop. "What happened to your daughter?" Diego asked softly, needing to know, needing to understand, needing some piece of truth in all this nightmare. "Please, I came here because of her message. She asked for help. Tell me what happened." The man stared at the counter at his own hand, still gripping the wood. When he spoke, his voice cracked on every other word, broke apart and reformed and broke again. "El Señor de las Moscas chose her, the Lord of Flies, Beelzebub. He chose her to be one of his brides, one of his vessels, one of his agents in this world. And when he chooses, there's no appeal, no negotiation, no mercy. You can't say no to him. You can't refuse. You can only watch as someone you love becomes something else, something that wears their face but isn't them anymore." Diego's blood went cold despite the heat. The Lord of Flies, one of the ancient names of Satan, one of the demon princes, one of the fallen angels who'd rebelled against heaven and been cast down to rule over legions of lesser demons and corrupted souls. But that was mythology, Diego told himself desperately. That was fairy tales and superstition and stories told to frighten children and keep peasants in line. Except he'd seen those bodies turning on their ropes. He'd seen those impossible smiles and those watching eyes. He'd heard those footsteps on the stairs. He'd eaten food with flies in it and watched a woman chew and swallow an insect without hesitation. The man didn't repeat what he'd said, didn't elaborate or explain. He just turned and walked toward the back of the store where a staircase led up to the family living quarters above the shop, moving like every step hurt, like his body was holding grief so heavy it made movement almost impossible. "No one decides here," the man whispered, barely audible, speaking to himself or to Diego, or to the absent God he probably still prayed to out of habit even though his prayers had accomplished nothing. "No one gets to choose. We're all just pieces being moved around by something bigger than us, something we can't fight or reason with or escape from." He climbed the stairs without looking back at Diego, without saying goodbye or offering any further information. His footsteps were slow and heavy, each one seeming to take enormous effort, and they creaked loudly in the silence. Diego stood alone in the shop at 3:35 p.m. on Sunday afternoon. Behind him, the wall clock continued its relentless ticking, marking seconds that felt like hours, marking time in a place where time seemed to work differently than it did in the world Diego knew. When he looked up at the clock face, he saw that the second hand had stopped moving forward, had frozen at the exact moment the man had looked at it, as if time itself had chosen to pause, as if the universe was waiting for something to happen before allowing the flow of seconds to resume. A single fly circled the light bulb overhead in a lazy, hypnotic pattern, bumping against the hot glass again and again and again, with soft tapping sounds that should have killed it or at least stunned it, but seemed to have no effect whatsoever. The fly just kept hitting the bulb, kept making that same small sound, as if it were knocking, as if it were trying to get in, as if the light itself held something it desperately needed or wanted. Diego left the shop at 3:40 p.m. and stood blinking in the harsh sunlight, his mind reeling, his sense of reality fracturing around the edges. He needed to leave, needed to escape, even if it meant walking for 8 hours in the heat, even if it meant risking death from exposure or dehydration. Staying here was worse. Staying here would cost him something more important than his life. He started walking toward the edge of the village at 4 p.m., determination overriding fear, when he heard footsteps behind him, quick and light, almost skipping the sound of small shoes hitting packed dirt with an uneven rhythm almost musical in its irregularity. "Wait, Diego, wait." He stopped and turned, his body tensing, preparing to run or fight or do whatever survival demanded. A young woman was hurrying toward him, maybe 20 years old, maybe younger, it was hard to tell. Her hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail, and her lips were painted bright red, garish in this setting, like someone had started to dress for a party and then lost enthusiasm halfway through. She wore a simple white dress that seemed too clean for this dusty environment, too pristine, as if dirt refused to cling to it. She was breathing hard, as if she'd been running, though Diego hadn't seen her coming from any specific direction, as if she'd simply materialized from one of the side streets or from behind one of the buildings. "You're Diego, right? The journalist from Mexico City. Elena told me about you, about the email." He nodded warily, saying nothing, every muscle in his body tense. "I'm Carmen," she said, stopping a few feet away from him, close, but not too close, maintaining a careful distance. "Elena's sister, her younger sister. I need to talk to you. I need to explain things before you try to leave, before you make things worse." Diego's mouth went dry. Another Vargas, another person connected to the woman hanging in the plaza. "Walk with me," Carmen said. And it wasn't quite a request, wasn't quite a command, but something in between that suggested refusing would be unwise. They walked together through the empty streets of the village, the sun beginning its slow descent toward the horizon, the shadows starting to lengthen and point east like fingers or arrows. Carmen spoke rapidly, her words tumbling out in a rush as if she'd been holding them in for days, and they were finally escaping, finally finding release. They had reasons for what they did to Elena, she began, and Diego noticed she didn't say killing her or murdering her, or executing her, just what they did, as if the specific acts were too terrible to name directly. I know how it sounds to an outsider, to someone from the city who doesn't understand how things work in places like this. It sounds like madness or hatred or ignorance. But they didn't hang my sister out of hate or fear. They hung her because she wasn't Elena anymore, because something else was living inside her body, wearing her face, using her voice, and that thing needed to be stopped before it killed more of us. Diego wanted to interrupt, wanted to argue, wanted to tell her that there had to be some other explanation, some rational answer that didn't involve demons or possession or supernatural evil. But something in Carmen's tone, something in the absolute certainty with which she spoke, made him just listen and let her words wash over him. It started maybe 2 months ago, maybe a little longer. It's hard to remember exactly when things shifted from strange to impossible. Carmen continued, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, not looking at Diego, as if she were reciting this story to herself as much as to him. We found her in the middle of the night out in our corral behind the house where we keep our animals. She was on her knees in the mud and blood, and she was eating the insides of one of our goats that had just given birth. The baby goat was stillborn. It happens sometimes, especially when it's hot, and the mothers don't get enough water, and Elena was just consuming it. The placenta, the organs, everything. Her hands and face were covered in blood and membrane and worse things. When we asked her what she was doing, why she would do something so horrible, she looked up at us with those flat eyes and said, "It shouldn't go to waste. The dead should always feed the living. That's how it's always been. That's how it should be." Diego felt his stomach turn, felt acid rising in his throat, but he forced it down and kept walking and kept listening. Another time, maybe a week after that, we woke up one morning and found all our chickens dead in the coop. Every single one, 17 chickens. But they weren't just dead. Their heads were all twisted backward, rotated 180 degrees on their necks, all of them facing the wrong direction. All of them arranged in a perfect row, as if someone had lined them up very carefully and deliberately. It must have taken hours to do something like that, must have required patience and focus and intention. Elena was the only one who could have done it. When we asked her about it, she just smiled, that strange smile she'd started doing, and said, "They were bothering me. They wouldn't stop clucking. Now they're quiet. Now everything is better." Carmen's voice wavered slightly, but didn't break, didn't falter. And then there were the flies, always the flies. Her room, the room we'd shared since we were children, the room where we'd grown up together and told each other secrets and dreamed about our futures, it became unbearable. Flies covered every surface, the walls, the ceiling, the furniture, everything. They weren't flying around making noise the way flies usually do. They were just sitting there, thousands of them, maybe tens of thousands, all perfectly still, except for the slightest trembling, all oriented in the same direction, as if they were waiting for a signal, as if they were soldiers in formation, waiting for orders from their general. They passed the dark river that ran along the eastern edge of the village, its surface reflecting the orange sky, moving slowly and carrying secrets in its currents. Diego could hear water flowing over stones, a sound that should have been peaceful but somehow felt ominous in this context. "We tried to help her," Carmen said, and for the first time Diego heard her voice crack with genuine emotion, heard pain breaking through that flat recitation. "We really did. We brought Father Thomas from 2 villages away, the one priest who still performed exorcisms, who still believed in the reality of evil spirits and demonic possession. He's old now, maybe 75 or 80, been doing this work for decades. He's seen things, fought things, cast out things that most people don't believe exist. But even he wouldn't enter Elena's room. He stood in the doorway, looked inside for maybe 10 seconds, made the sign of the cross, and then backed away. He told us, and I'll never forget his exact words. He said, 'There's nothing I can do for her. She belongs to something older than my prayers, older than my faith, older than the church itself. She belongs to him now, to the Lord of Flies. And once he's claimed someone, once he's put his mark on them, they're his forever. The only mercy left is to make sure she can't spread his influence further. Can't make more victims, can't open more doors. That's what he said. Then he left, and we never saw him again. Diego's hands were shaking now, trembling with something beyond fear, something closer to existential dread, to the vertigo that comes from realizing the world is fundamentally different from what you'd always believed. "So what happened?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "When did everything change? When did she become whatever she became?" Carmen stopped walking and turned to face him directly for the first time since they'd started this conversation. Her eyes were clear and dry, no tears, just absolute certainty and something else Diego couldn't quite read, resignation maybe, or acceptance of something terrible. "I was there, in the room with her. I saw it happen. I'm probably the only person alive who watched the actual moment of transformation and lived to tell about it." Diego waited, not breathing, not moving. Carmen's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, forcing Diego to lean in to hear her properly. "Elena left the window open that night, the window that faced the fields and the mountains beyond, the window that never got opened because it let in too many insects. She propped it all the way open with a stick, and then she took a piece of raw meat from the kitchen, a piece of pork from the pig we'd butchered 2 days earlier, and she placed it very carefully on the windowsill. Not thrown there, not dropped there, but placed with deliberate care, positioned exactly right. When I asked her what she was doing, she turned to me and smiled that new smile she'd developed, that wrong smile, and said, 'I need to attract something. I need to call them. They're waiting for permission to enter.' Then she went to bed like it was the most normal thing in the world, laid down and closed her eyes as if she were just going to sleep." Diego felt cold despite the heat still radiating from the ground and buildings around them. The flies came maybe an hour after full darkness, maybe a little longer. They came in complete silence, which was the strangest part, because flies, buzz flies, make noise, that's just what they do. But these came in silence, like a held breath, like something sneaking, like something that didn't want to alert anyone to its presence. Just a few at first, maybe 5 or 10 flying in through that open window and circling the room. Then dozens, then hundreds, then so many I couldn't even count them, couldn't even estimate. The numbers became meaningless. The room went from dimly lit by moonlight to completely black. In maybe 30 seconds, just filled completely with flies, the darkness so total I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. Carmen's hands were shaking now too, her whole body trembling slightly with the memory. The sound started then, not buzzing exactly, though there was some of that. It was more like breathing, like something enormous was taking slow, deep breaths, inhaling and exhaling with the rhythm of a sleeping giant. And I realized the sound was all the flies moving in synchronization, their wings beating in perfect coordination, creating a composite sound that was nothing like individual insects. It was alive. It was aware. It was breathing. Diego wanted her to stop, wanted not to hear the rest, but she kept going, kept speaking, as if she couldn't stop now, even if she wanted to. I couldn't see Elena anymore. Couldn't see her body on the bed, couldn't see anything except this shifting darkness, this cloud of flies that had engulfed her completely. But I could hear her. I could hear sounds coming from where she should be. Sounds that weren't quite human. Choking sounds, gagging sounds, sounds of things going into a body through openings that should be closed. And I knew, I don't know how, but I knew with absolute certainty that the flies were going into her mouth and her nose and her eyes and probably other places I don't want to think about. Going in and not coming back out. Being absorbed, being incorporated. I could actually see movement under her skin when the cloud shifted and moonlight broke through for just a second. Things moving beneath the surface, things migrating through her body, things rearranging her from the inside out. Diego tasted bile again, fought it down again, forced himself to keep listening. Then I heard her laugh. But it wasn't Elena's laugh. It wasn't any laugh I'd ever heard from any human being. It was layered, harmonized, like 20 or 30 voices, all laughing at once, all perfectly synchronized, but all at slightly different pitches. Men's voices and women's voices and children's voices and voices that I couldn't identify, that didn't sound like they could come from human vocal cords. The laughter went on for maybe 30 seconds and then cut off abruptly, instantaneously, leaving silence that was somehow worse than the sound had been. When the flies finally left, and they left as suddenly as they'd arrived, just dispersed all at once like they'd received a signal only they could detect, the room was lit by moonlight again, and I could see the bed. Elena was lying there exactly as she had been when she went to sleep, in the same position, her hands folded on her chest. But her eyes were open, wide open, staring at the ceiling. And they were different, not in color or shape or anything physical I could point to, but in what was behind them, in the intelligence looking out through them. Those weren't Elena's eyes anymore, even though they were still in Elena's head. Those were something else's eyes, something ancient and hungry and patient. Something that had been waiting a very long time for a door to open and now finally had a body to walk around in. Carmen started walking again, and Diego followed automatically, his legs moving without conscious decision. From that night on, everything changed. Elena only went out after midnight, and we'd hear the door open and close, and then she'd be gone until just before dawn. Animals in the village started dying in bizarre ways, eviscerated or drained or dismembered, with a precision that suggested intelligence and purpose rather than predation. A child went missing from his bed one night, Emilio Cruz, 7 years old, beautiful boy with big eyes and the sweetest laugh. They found him 3 days later at the bottom of the old well on the north side of the village, drowned with stones sewn into his pockets to weigh him down, and Elena had been seen watching his house in the days before he disappeared, just standing in the shadows watching his window. Diego felt something fundamental break inside him, some last barrier between what he believed was possible and what he'd been witnessing. That's when the rumors really exploded, when everyone started talking openly about what had been whispered about for weeks, about the witches, about the return of El Señor de las Moscas, about Beelzebub walking among us again after centuries or millennia of absence. More women started acting strange, displaying the same symptoms Elena had shown. More flies appeared everywhere in numbers we'd never seen before, thick clouds of them hovering over the village like a curse made manifest. It spread like a disease, like an infection, jumping from host to host, each new victim opening another door for him, giving him another agent in our world. They reached the plaza at 5:30 p.m. on Sunday evening. In the fading light, Diego could see all the shapes hanging from all the trees, could see them more clearly than he wanted to, could count them if he forced himself to. They tried burning her first. Carmen said, her voice completely flat again. All emotion drained out, just reporting facts. They built that fire in the center of the plaza, used wood and gasoline and everything they could think of to make it hot enough. They put Elena in the center and lit it. 3 times the fire went out on its own, just extinguished itself impossibly, even though the fuel was there and the conditions were right. No rain, no wind, nothing natural to explain it. Just fires that started to burn and then died, as if something was snuffing them out deliberately. The 4th time they tried it finally worked. The flames finally stayed lit and consumed her body, and everyone thought it was over, thought she was gone. Carmen pointed to the scorched circle beneath the tree where Elena now hung. But when they went to pull her body from the ashes, to bury it, when the flames had finally died down and the remains had cooled enough to touch, they discovered her face had changed. It wasn't Elena's face anymore, even burned and charred. It was the face of Rosa Delgado, an old woman who died 6 years earlier, who we'd buried in the cemetery on the hill with her entire family in attendance. Somehow Elena's burned body had Rosa Delgado's face, and we understood then what we were dealing with. The witches can steal faces, can wear the appearances of the dead to confuse us, to make us burn the wrong people. We realized we'd already burned 3 innocent women before Elena, 3 people who looked like witches, But weren't 3 murders on our souls that can never be forgiven or undone? Diego felt like he might vomit, but kept it together through sheer force of will. So now we hang them first instead. We hang them, and we wait sometimes days, sometimes weeks, watching them up there in the trees until their faces settle, until we're absolutely certain we have the right person, that they haven't stolen someone else's identity at the last second. Only then, once we're sure, do we burn them. But we've learned we can't take them down afterward. The ropes won't allow it. They tighten if you touch them, become like living snakes, and anyone who tries gets sick in ways that medicine can't treat. So we leave them hanging. We let them stay there as warnings and as containment, because as long as they're up in those trees, they can't spread his influence further, can't recruit more victims, can't open more doors for him to come through. They were standing very close now, close enough that Diego could smell Carmen's breath, could detect something sweet on it, like honey, but not quite honey, something with an underlying chemical note that didn't belong. "But they're not really dead," Carmen whispered, leaning in even closer, her words for Diego alone, even though there was no one else around to hear. "The women in the trees, they're not dead in any way that matters. They don't need food or water or air up there. They just wait. They're patient. They have all the time in the world because time doesn't mean the same thing to them anymore. They're waiting for enough of them to gather for the number to reach whatever threshold is required, and then they'll call him. They'll summon their master. They'll bring El Señor de las Moscas fully into our world, instead of just sending pieces of himself, just sending extensions and agents. And when he comes in his full form, in his true body, this village will burn, everything will burn, and the flies will finally have their kingdom on earth." "Waiting for what?" Diego asked, though he already knew, already understood, already felt the truth of it settling into his bones. For the right witness, for someone from outside who came here willingly, who walked through that door by choice, who saw everything with their own eyes and will carry the story back into the world. Someone exactly like you, Diego. Someone who received an invitation and accepted it, who ignored all the warnings and came anyway. That's what completes the ritual. That's what opens the final door. A fly landed on Diego's cheek at that exact moment, as if it had been waiting for precisely this revelation to manifest. He felt its tiny legs walking across his skin, felt it moving toward his lips, toward his mouth, seeking entry. He swatted at it violently, desperately, his hand moving fast enough to create a small breeze. The fly buzzed through the air in a lazy arc and landed on Carmen's hand on her palm, sitting there like a small, dark jewel against her brown skin. She looked at it for a long moment, tilted her head as if listening to something only she could hear. Then she lifted her hand slowly to her face, moving with deliberate care, with ritual precision. Her mouth opened. The fly walked across her palm, marched to the edge of her fingers with clear purpose, and then crawled into her mouth, as if it were coming home, as if this was where it had always belonged. Carmen closed her lips around it. Diego heard that small, terrible sound again, the crunch of an exoskeleton crushing between molars, the sound of a body being destroyed and consumed. Carmen's jaw worked once, twice, chewing with her eyes closed, as if savoring the taste or the texture or the experience. Then she swallowed her throat, moving visibly, and opened her eyes and smiled at Diego, and kept talking as if nothing whatsoever had happened, as if eating flies was as normal and unremarkable as eating tortillas or drinking water. "You should leave, Diego. Tomorrow morning, 6 a.m., the combi will actually come. They'll let you go now because you've seen everything you needed to see, because you're carrying exactly what they wanted you to carry. Take it and run back to your comfortable life in Mexico City, because the day after tomorrow there won't be a village here anymore, just ash and bones and flies." Diego couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, couldn't process what he was witnessing. The fly. She'd eaten a fly. Just like the old woman, just like... And then he noticed something else, something that made his vision start to tunnel, made the world seem to tilt and spin. The hem of Carmen's white dress, the bottom edge that should be touching the ground hanging down to her ankles. It wasn't touching the ground. She was floating, just an inch, maybe less, so subtle you'd miss it if you weren't looking directly at her feet. But she definitely, unmistakably, was not standing on the ground. Her feet hung in the air, her toes pointing downward but not making contact with the earth, as if gravity had released its grip on her just slightly, as if she was in the process of ascending, but hadn't quite committed to it yet. Before Diego could say anything, before he could ask or comment or run screaming, a gust of wind suddenly tore through the plaza at 5:45 p.m. Strong enough to make Diego stagger, to make him put out his arms for balance, strong enough that it should have knocked Carmen over completely given her apparent weightlessness. The wind lifted the edge of Carmen's dress, caught it, and sent it billowing upward, and the fabric brushed across Diego's face as it rose. The texture was wrong. Completely, fundamentally wrong. Not cotton or linen or any cloth Diego had ever felt. It felt more like leather, but not quite leather, more like paper, but not quite paper. Something organic that had been preserved or mummified, something that had once been alive and was dead now, but still retained some echo of what it had been. And it was cold, so cold that where it touched his skin it burned, leaving a sensation of frostbite, even though they were standing in desert heat, even though the temperature was still over 90 degrees. At the exact same moment, clouds that had been building on the horizon broke apart, torn by wind or by something else, and moonlight too bright, too white, impossibly intense for moon that wasn't full, flooded down into the plaza like a spotlight, like divine illumination, like the universe itself had decided this moment needed to be witnessed in absolute clarity. And in that impossible light, Diego saw it. At the far end of the plaza, maybe 50 meters away, something was moving toward them. At first glance, at first quick assessment, it looked like a man walking, like a human figure approaching with steady purpose. But the movement was wrong, was too smooth, too fluid, like something gliding an inch above the ground rather than stepping on it, like something that didn't quite understand how walking worked and was imitating it imperfectly. Then Diego's eyes focused, properly adjusted to the light and the distance, and his brain finally processed what he was actually looking at, and every rational thought in his mind simply ceased, simply shut down, simply gave up trying to make sense of reality. It wasn't a man. It was flies. Millions of flies, maybe billions, far more than should be able to exist in one place at one time, all moving together in perfect coordination to form the rough shape of a human being. A body that assembled and dissolved and reassembled with every movement, never quite solid, never quite permanent, constantly shifting and reforming, but maintaining an overall humanoid outline. Arms and legs and a torso, and a head all made of insects flying in impossible formation. The sound was what finally broke through Diego's shock, what penetrated through his frozen panic. Not individual buzzing, not the sound of separate insects. This was something else entirely, a composite noise that was nothing like its components. It sounded like machinery, like a massive engine or turbine spinning up to operational speed. Or like breathing, like something enormous taking slow, deep breaths. Or like wings, millions of wings beating in perfect synchronization, creating a drone so deep Diego felt it in his bones, in his teeth, in the hollow spaces of his skull, in his chest cavity, resonating like a drum. And it had a face made of swarming, writhing, constantly moving flies that somehow impossibly held together just long enough to have features. Eyes that were just voids between clusters, just gaps in the swarm where no insects flew, creating the impression of pupils and irises through absence rather than presence. A mouth that opened too wide, far wider than any human mouth, showing more flies inside, thousands more, pouring out of the opening like smoke from a chimney, or blood from a wound, a never-ending stream of insects emerging from some impossible interior that shouldn't exist. The face turned toward Diego, the void eyes fixed on him with absolute focus, with complete attention, with the kind of regard a predator gives prey, or a collector gives a specimen, or a god gives a worshipper. And Diego knew. knew with certainty that transcended logic or evidence or reason. This thing recognized him personally, individually, specifically, knew his name, knew why he'd come here, had been waiting for him specifically. This entire situation, from the moment he'd read Elena's email, had been arranged, orchestrated, designed to bring him to this exact place, at this exact time, to witness this exact thing. He was part of the ritual. He'd always been part of it. The invitation, the journey, the village, everything had been planned. The buzzing grew until it wasn't sound anymore, but physical pressure, like hands pushing against Diego's eardrums from the inside and outside simultaneously, like his head was caught in a vice that was slowly, methodically tightening. His vision blurred at the edges, started to tunnel, started to go dark, except for that thing in the center, that impossible entity that shouldn't exist but did, that was walking toward him with terrible purpose. The air itself changed, became thick and viscous and hard to move through, like he was suddenly underwater, or buried in sand, like atmosphere had spontaneously transformed into something solid that he had to push through with every breath and movement. Diego tried to inhale and couldn't get enough oxygen, couldn't get his lungs to expand properly, as if he were on a mountain peak or in an airplane with failing cabin pressure. The smell hit him like a physical attack. Rotting meat, yes, but not just any rotting meat, human meat, the specific stench of human decomposition that some primitive part of Diego's brain recognized and recoiled from. And underneath that, something sweet and cloying like concentrated honey that had fermented into alcohol. And underneath that, something else entirely, something his brain had no reference for, no framework to process, something ancient and fundamentally wrong, something that didn't belong in this world or this dimension or this reality. And then the voice. Not sound waves traveling through air and vibrating his eardrums. Nothing so simple, nothing so normal. The voice went straight into Diego's head, bypassed his ears, entirely manifested directly in his consciousness like a thought, except it wasn't. His thought could never be. His thought came from outside, from that thing walking toward him. Not words exactly, just the concept of words, the idea of communication. Pure meaning without language, without grammar, without syntax. But Diego understood it with perfect clarity. Understood it better than he'd ever understood spoken language. Soon. That was all. Just that single concept, that single promise or threat or statement of inevitable fact. Soon. Diego ran at 5:50 p.m. on Sunday evening. He didn't decide to run, didn't consciously choose flight over fight or freeze. His body simply took over millions of years of evolutionary programming, overriding conscious thought survival instinct, bypassing higher brain functions entirely. His legs pumped, his arms swung, his lungs gasped for air that wouldn't come properly, and he ran. He didn't remember the route back to Senora Rosa's house. Didn't remember navigating streets or avoiding obstacles or choosing which way to turn. He just found himself there suddenly, impossibly, as if he'd teleported, or as if time had skipped, or as if the journey had happened in some space outside normal reality. Found himself in his room gasping and shaking and pressing his back against the wall. His heart beating so fast and so hard he thought it might rupture, might literally explode in his chest. He grabbed the metal bed frame with hands that could barely grip, dragged it across the floor with strength he didn't know he possessed, wedged it against the door. The metal screamed against concrete, a sound like torture, a sound like dying. Outside footsteps, slow, methodical. Walking past the house with that same measured pace from the night before, that same 3-second interval between steps. 1, 2, 3, footfall. 1, 2, 3, footfall, then stopping. Right outside, right below Diego's window. Then the sound of something scraping against the window screen from outside. Something testing the barrier, checking its strength, determining whether entry was possible or desirable. Not trying to force it. Not attempting to break through. Just checking. Just letting Diego know it was there and it was aware of him and it could enter whenever it chose. The buzzing returned, filled Diego's head, became the only sound in the universe. That composite drone of millions of wings, that breathing of something massive and hungry. It was inside his skull now, pressing against the inside of his cranium, trying to push his eyeballs out from behind, trying to force his teeth apart, and underneath the buzzing, that voice again, that non-voice, that direct communication. Soon, just that, just the promise, just the certainty. Diego pressed his hands over his ears, even though he knew it wouldn't help, even though he knew the sound wasn't entering through his ears, even though he knew the voice was inside him already. He sank to the floor, pulled his knees to his chest, squeezed his eyes shut so tightly, colored lights exploded behind his eyelids and stayed like that for hours, trembling, gasping. Praying to a God he wasn't sure he believed in, to a God he wasn't sure believed in him. Outside, the night settled over the village like a funeral shroud. And from the trees in the plaza, 22 pairs of dead eyes watched and waited and smiled their impossible smiles. Dawn came at 6 a.m. on Monday, June 15, 2009. Diego had not slept, had not closed his eyes for more than a few seconds at a time, had sat against that wall all night, every muscle rigid, every nerve firing, existing in a state of pure, terrified vigilance that human bodies aren't designed to sustain. But he was alive. He'd survived. The sun was rising. And today the combi would come. Today he could finally escape. Diego moved the bed away from the door at 6:30 a.m. on Monday morning, his muscles screaming in protest after being held rigid for so many hours. Every joint ached. His hands trembled uncontrollably. His eyes burned from a lack of sleep, felt like they'd been rubbed with sand, like his eyelids were scraping across raw nerve endings every time he blinked. He grabbed his backpack without checking its contents, without caring if he'd left anything behind in this cursed room. Nothing material mattered anymore. Only escape, only survival, only getting back to a world that made sense, where demons were metaphors and flies were just insects and dead people stayed dead. He crept down the stairs as quietly as possible, every creak of the old wood sounding impossibly loud in the morning silence, expecting at any moment for Señora Rosa to appear and try to stop him, to chain the door again, to tell him he couldn't leave, that he was part of something now and would never truly be free. But the house remained silent. The chains were already removed from the front door, hanging loose on a hook beside the frame. Rosa was nowhere to be seen, nowhere to be heard, as if she'd vanished or had never existed at all. Diego pushed through the door at 6:45 a.m. and ran toward the road where the combi should arrive. His backpack bouncing painfully against his spine, his lungs burning in air that already felt hot despite the early hour. He didn't look back at the village, didn't glance toward the plaza, didn't allow his eyes to stray toward those trees and what hung from them. He just ran, focusing on the path ahead, on escape, on the promise of wheels and motion and distance. He reached the pickup point at 7:15 a.m. and collapsed in the dirt, gasping for breath, his vision swimming with exhaustion and dehydration and terror barely held in check. Then he waited, counting seconds, counting minutes, his entire existence focused on that road, on the sound of an approaching engine, on salvation in the form of a battered white van. At 8:30 a.m. on Monday, June 15, 2009, Diego heard it. The distant growl of a motor laboring up the mountain road, getting closer, getting louder, becoming more real with every passing second. He stood up on shaking legs, moved to the middle of the road, prepared to throw himself in front of the vehicle if necessary to make absolutely certain it stopped. The combi appeared around the bend at 8:35 a.m. The same driver, the same van, the same everything from 3 days ago, as if no time had passed, as if Diego's experience had been happening in some pocket dimension separate from normal time. The van slowed and stopped. The driver looked at Diego through the windshield, his expression unreadable behind sunglasses and cigarette smoke. Need a ride? Simple, casual. As if this were a normal pickup, a normal passenger, a normal Monday morning. Yes, Diego managed his voice coming out as a croak barely human. Please, I need to leave, now." The driver nodded once, jerked his head toward the side door. "Get in." Diego climbed aboard at 8:37 a.m., found a seat, pressed himself against the window. 3 other passengers were already inside, different people from before, people Diego had never seen, people who didn't seem to register his presence or care about his obvious distress. The door slid shut, the engine engaged, and the combi began to move, began to carry Diego away from that place, began to put distance between him and the nightmare. As they drove away from the village, as the road descended and the buildings receded into the distance, Diego allowed himself one glance back through the rear window. Just one. Just to confirm it was really behind him, really shrinking, really becoming part of his past rather than his present. In the morning light, clear and harsh and unforgiving, he could see the plaza perfectly, could see every tree, could see every rope, could see everybody hanging from every branch, and every single one of them had turned to face the direction of the departing combi. Every head had rotated on its rope, everybody had shifted position, all of them tracking his exit with their impossible eyes, all of them watching him leave with their impossible smiles. 22 pairs of eyes, 22 smiles, all focused on him. Diego turned away and didn't look back again. The combi rumbled down the dirt road, and with every meter of distance he felt something loosen slightly in his chest, felt the pressure in his head ease fractionally. But the relief was incomplete, tainted because he knew with absolute certainty that he was taking something with him, carrying something back into the world that should have stayed contained in that village. The journey back was a blur of exhaustion and shock. The combi ride to the state capital took 3 hours. Then Diego waited 4 hours for the next bus heading south to Mexico City, sitting in the terminal in a daze, unable to eat despite his hunger, unable to drink despite his thirst, just staring at nothing, and replaying everything in his mind over and over, trying to process the impossible, trying to integrate the unintegrable. The executive bus took 9 hours, same as the journey up had been. Diego slept fitfully, dreaming of flies and ropes and women with stretched smiles. Other passengers gave him a wide berth, as if they could sense something wrong with him, as if trauma and contamination were visible on his skin. When the bus finally pulled into Mexico City's terminal at 2:30 a.m. on Tuesday, June 16th, Diego took a taxi directly to his father's house in Polanco. He couldn't face his apartment, couldn't face being alone, couldn't face the isolation of his own space where there would be no one to anchor him to reality, no one to confirm that he still existed in the normal world. Don Roberto was awake despite the late hour, working in his study, as always perpetually chasing deadlines, perpetually fighting battles he chose carefully. He looked up when Diego walked in, and whatever he saw in his son's face made him stand immediately. Made the color drain from his own face, made his expression shift from annoyance at being interrupted to genuine alarm. "What happened to you?" Diego told him everything, every detail. The village, the bodies, the flies, Elena Vargas hanging with her eyes open, and that smile that couldn't exist. Carmen eating a fly without hesitation, floating an inch off the ground. The entity in the plaza, the thing made of millions of insects, forming a shape that spoke directly into his mind. He told it all in a rush, the words pouring out like blood from a wound, like poison being purged, like confession before execution. Don Roberto listened in complete silence, his expression growing darker and more troubled with each sentence, his hands gripping the edge of his desk until his knuckles went white. When Diego finally finished, when the words ran out and he sat there trembling and waiting for response, his father sat back heavily in his chair and was quiet for a long moment. "You went through my emails," Don Roberto said finally, and Diego felt the words like a slap, like betrayal, like accusation at the worst possible moment. "You violated my privacy, read my personal correspondence, and decided to go play hero without telling anyone where you were going or what you were doing. Dad, did you hear what do you have any idea how dangerous that was?" Don Roberto's voice rose, anger breaking through his usually controlled demeanor. Not because of witches or demons or any supernatural bullshit, but because there are places in this country, real places, physical places, where outsiders disappear, where asking the wrong questions gets you killed, where cartels or corrupt police or local strongmen do whatever the hell they want, because no one's watching, because no one cares enough to intervene. I saw it, Diego insisted, desperation making his voice crack. I saw what I saw. 20 women hanging from trees. Their eyes were moving. They were watching me. And that thing in the plaza, you saw what they wanted you to see. Don Roberto's fist hit the desk, making papers jump and a coffee mug rattle. These isolated villages have practices, Diego. They have plants, mushrooms, compounds derived from cacti and roots and God knows what else. Things they put in the water supply or cook into food that cause hallucinations, that alter perception, that make people see and hear and experience things that aren't there. They probably drugged you the moment you arrived, probably dosed every meal they gave you, probably had you tripping on psychedelics for 3 straight days without you even knowing it. The bodies were real. The flies were real. The bodies are probably real, Don Roberto agreed, his voice dropping back to normal volume but remaining hard, unyielding. Probably women these people killed for owning land or speaking up or threatening whoever's in charge. That's the real story here, Diego. Not demons, murder, human evil, which is more than sufficient to explain everything you witnessed without invoking the supernatural. Diego wanted to argue further, wanted to insist, wanted to make his father understand. But then he remembered. The notebook. He still had the notebook in his backpack. With all his notes, all his observations, all the documentation he'd carefully recorded. That would prove it. That would show his father he wasn't delusional or drugged or mistaken. He pulled out the notebook with shaking hands, held it up like a talisman, like evidence, like vindication. But when he opened it, when he flipped through the pages, his blood turned to ice water in his veins. Every page had been torn out, not missing torn. Little strips of paper still clung to the spiral binding like broken teeth, like the remnants of something that had been violently extracted. Evidence that there had been writing, that pages had existed, that Diego's documentation had been real. But the actual content, the actual words, the actual proof, all gone. Someone had been in his bag. Someone had carefully, methodically removed every single page while he slept or wasn't looking. Someone had erased his evidence, had eliminated his proof, had ensured that nothing but his word, the word of an exhausted, traumatized student, remained. Diego stared at the empty notebook, his last hope crumbling. Don Roberto looked at the torn pages and shook his head slowly, sadly. You probably did that yourself, hijo. In a panic, in some altered state. Paranoid delusions make people do strange things. Make them destroy evidence of their own experiences because some part of them knows it wasn't real. Knows it can't be real, knows that keeping it would mean accepting madness. I didn't. Diego. Don Roberto's voice softened, became gentle, became concerned in a way that was somehow worse than anger. I'm not saying you're lying. I believe you believe what you're telling me. But I'm saying your perception was compromised. Your brain was affected by substances you didn't know you were taking. What you remember isn't what actually happened. It's what those substances made you experience, what your drugged mind interpreted and constructed from partial sensory input. He stood up and came around the desk, put his hand on Diego's shoulder with genuine affection and worry. You're lucky. Incredibly, impossibly lucky that you got out of there alive, that they didn't decide to kill you or keep you or do something worse. Let this go. Don't ever do something like this again. Don't chase stories in places where you don't understand the rules, where you can't distinguish between reality and manipulation. Promise me. Diego looked at his father and saw genuine fear. There saw concern and love and desperation for Diego to accept this explanation, to let it go, to move on. And part of Diego, the part that wanted to survive that, wanted to be normal again, that wanted to sleep without nightmares, wanted to agree, wanted to accept, wanted to believe that drugs and isolation had created an experience that seemed real but wasn't. "I promise," Diego whispered, though they both knew it was a lie. That night Diego dreamed of flies, thousands of them covering his body, crawling into his mouth and nose, moving beneath his skin. He woke up screaming at 4 a.m., swatting at phantom insects, his sheets soaked with sweat. He woke up screaming again at 5:30 a.m., and again at dawn. His father heard but didn't come. Some things you have to face alone. The weeks that followed were the hardest of Diego's life. He went back to university but couldn't focus on lectures, couldn't concentrate on readings, couldn't participate in discussions. He'd sit in class and hear the professor's voice, but the words would blur together into meaningless sound, and all he could think about were those bodies turning on their ropes, those eyes watching him leave that voice in his head saying soon. His girlfriend Maria noticed the change within days, noticed that Diego was different, that something fundamental had shifted in him. He was distant, jumpy, paranoid. He refused to eat at restaurants where he couldn't see the kitchen, where he couldn't watch his food being prepared. He refused to sleep with the windows open, no matter how hot it got. He developed an obsession with flies, would hunt them down with rolled newspapers and kill them with excessive force, with violence that seemed personal, as if each fly was an enemy combatant rather than a harmless insect. After a month of this, after Diego had canceled 3 dates and ignored 24 calls and responded to messages with one-word answers, Maria sat him down for what she clearly intended to be a serious conversation. "What happened on that trip? Where did you actually go?" "Nowhere important," Diego lied, and the lie felt like ashes in his mouth. "Just did some research. Didn't find what I was looking for." She didn't believe him. He could see it in her eyes, could see her trying to decide whether to push or let it go. She chose to push. "You're different, Diego. You're not the same person who left." "Something happened to you and you won't tell me what it was, and I can't help you if you won't talk to me." "I'm fine, just tired, just stressed about exams." Another lie. Another ash taste. Another small betrayal. Within 2 months, Maria had left him unable to deal with his distance and his paranoia and his refusal to let her in. Diego didn't fight. It didn't try to convince her to stay, because some part of him knew he was protecting her, knew that whatever he'd brought back from that village was better kept isolated, better prevented from spreading to people he cared about. Time passed. Months became years. Diego graduated with grades that were good enough, but not exceptional. His former academic promise eroded by trauma and distraction. He got a job at a small newspaper covering local politics and municipal corruption, safe stories about human problems that could be solved by human means. He avoided anything that might take him out of the city, anything that might require him to venture into isolated areas, anything that might remind him of that village between the mountains. He met someone new eventually, Anna, a school teacher who was kind and patient, and asked no questions about his past because she had her own difficult history, and understood that some things were better left unexamined. They dated for a year. He proposed. She said yes. They married in a simple ceremony with both families in attendance, Don Roberto giving a toast about second chances and new beginnings, about leaving the past behind and building futures. Children came. A son they named Carlos, a daughter they named Sofia. Diego became a father and found that fatherhood anchored him, gave him something to focus on besides his own demons, gave him a reason to push through the nightmares and the paranoia and the constant low-level fear that had become his baseline emotional state. He became an editor at a respected magazine, his byline appearing in the same publications his father's had, achieving the success he'd always wanted, but finding it hollow, empty, meaningless compared to the weight of what he carried. Years passed. 5, 10, 15. Diego had a house in a good neighborhood, a career that was respected, children in private schools, a wife who loved him despite his occasional episodes, despite the nights when he woke up screaming about flies. He had achieved the Mexican dream, had built the kind of comfortable middle-class life that millions aspired to, but few achieved. And he thought about the village less and less frequently. Not because the memories had faded, they remained crystalline, perfect, undimmed by time, but because he got better at pushing them away, at building walls around them, at functioning, despite their presence, rather than trying to process or integrate them. The village became something from his youth, a strange detour, a temporary madness, a story he didn't tell at parties because it made people uncomfortable and raised questions he couldn't answer. Something that had happened to a different Diego, a younger Diego, a more naive Diego, who no longer existed. Until one night in June 2024, 15 years and 3 days after his visit to the village, when Diego received an email that shattered every wall he'd built, every defense he'd constructed, every lie he'd told himself about moving on and leaving it behind. It was late past midnight on Thursday, June 13th, 2024. His family was asleep upstairs in the house they'd bought 5 years earlier. Diego was in his home office on the ground floor, finishing an article about corruption in the city's water department, working toward a deadline that was technically tomorrow, but that Diego had learned to treat as today. His computer chimed softly with the notification of a new email arriving. Diego glanced at it reflexively, expecting spam or work correspondence or something equally mundane. The sender's name made his hands freeze on the keyboard, made his breath catch in his throat, made 15 years of carefully constructed normalcy crack like thin ice. Elena Vargas. For several long seconds, Diego couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't do anything except stare at that name on his screen. Then his hand, moving on its own against his will, against every survival instinct, reached for the mouse and clicked on the message. It opened at 12:47 a.m. on Friday, June 14, 2024. The message was short, only one sentence, 7 words in Spanish that Diego understood with perfect, terrible clarity. Gracias por ser nuestro testigo. Thank you for being our witness. That was all. No signature, no elaboration, no explanation. Just those 7 words and then nothing. Diego stared at the screen, his heart rate accelerating, his hands beginning to shake with that old familiar tremor he thought he'd left behind years ago. He checked the email address with fingers that could barely control the mouse. It was the same one. The exact same one from 15 years ago, Ivargas_2009@hotmail.com. The random string of letters and numbers, the disposable account that should have been deleted years ago, that should have expired and vanished from existence. He checked the timestamp of when the message was sent. 3 minutes ago. Sent at 12:44 a.m. from that dead account, from that impossible address. Diego didn't tell Ana. Didn't wake her up. Didn't even consider it. The next morning, Friday, he told her he had to go check on a story for work, that he'd be back in a few days, that it wasn't dangerous, just routine, nothing to worry about. He saw the concern in her eyes, saw her trying to decide whether to ask more questions, saw her choosing to trust him despite her doubts. "Be safe," she said, and kissed him goodbye. And Diego wondered if she somehow knew, somehow sensed, that he might not come back the same, that this journey might take him away from her in ways that distance couldn't measure. He rented a truck, something sturdy with 4-wheel drive, something that could handle rough terrain, and drove north on Friday, June 14, 2024. 9 hours to the state capital, then following half-remembered routes looking for landmarks that might have changed, might have disappeared, might never have existed in the first place. The roads were worse than he remembered, washed out in places by 15 years of neglect and weather. Development had bypassed this region completely, had focused on other areas with more resources or better political connections. It took longer to find the turnoff than Diego expected, and for a while he thought perhaps he'd imagined the whole thing, perhaps his memory had constructed a location that didn't exist. But then he recognized a rock formation, distinctive, impossible to mistake, the kind of natural landmark that doesn't change across decades or centuries. And from there, he found the road, found the path, found the way back to a place he'd sworn he'd never return to. The landscape changed as he got closer, and Diego felt his stomach clench with recognition and dread. The green of the surrounding hills gave way gradually to something else. Something wrong. Something that shouldn't exist in nature. Black earth. At first Diego told himself it was just drought, just exposed soil, just a temporary condition that rain would fix. But as he drove closer, as the blackness spread further and became more absolute, he understood what he was looking at. Ash. Scorched earth. Ground burned so thoroughly, so completely, so absolutely that 15 years later nothing would grow on it. Nothing could grow on it. The soil rendered sterile by temperatures that shouldn't be possible from any natural fire. Diego parked the truck at 4:30 p.m. on Friday, June 14, 2024, at what he calculated was approximately where the village had been, though it was hard to be certain because every landmark was gone, every reference point erased. He stepped out onto ground that crunched under his feet like charcoal, like the remains of something that had been reduced to its most basic components and then abandoned. Where the village had been, where 20-something houses had stood, where people had lived and died, where he'd spent 3 days in hell, there was nothing. Not ruins, not collapsed buildings, not burned-out foundations or melted metal, or any physical evidence that human habitation had ever existed here. Just flat black ground stretching for acres in every direction. The earth itself looked glassy in places, as if it had melted under impossible heat, and then cooled into something that wasn't quite natural, wasn't quite right. Diego walked toward where he remembered the plaza being toward the center of the destroyed area, his feet raising small puffs of ash with each step. He knew this was the right place. He could feel it in his bones and his gut in some sense that operated beyond normal perception. This was where the trees had stood. This was where the bodies had hung. This was where he'd seen that thing, that entity, that manifestation of something ancient and hungry. The trees were gone, not burned stumps, not fallen trunks, just gone completely, as if they'd been erased from reality rather than merely destroyed. But Diego knew with absolute certainty that this was the place. No birds sang, no insects buzzed, no wind stirred the ash. The silence was total, absolute, oppressive. And for the first time since arriving at this place 15 years ago, Diego didn't hear flies. The buzzing that had been constant, that had followed him even in dreams, that had become a kind of psychological tinnitus, it was gone, completely, utterly absent. The silence where the buzzing should have been was somehow worse than the sound had been. Diego stood in the center of the destroyed plaza for a long time, 10 minutes, maybe 15, maybe longer, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he remembered, trying to understand what had happened here, trying to process the implications. Carmen had said they would burn the village, had said the witches would rain fire from the sky, would destroy everything, would claim their kingdom. She'd been right. Whatever had happened here, it had been absolute, had been total, had left nothing behind but ash and absence. Diego pulled out his phone at 5:15 p.m. and took photographs of the devastation of the black earth, of the complete erasure of human presence. But when he checked the images, when he tried to view what he'd just captured, every photograph showed only static, gray-white noise corrupting each frame, visual static, like an old television tuned to a dead channel, as if the camera couldn't process what it was seeing, as if reality itself was rejecting documentation. He tried again with the same result, and again. The phone worked perfectly, otherwise he could access apps, check email, make calls if he had signal. But photographs of this place simply wouldn't save, wouldn't render, wouldn't exist. Some things aren't meant to be documented. Some things resist recording. Some things exist in spaces between verification and doubt. Diego got back in his truck at 5:45 p.m. on Friday, June 14, 2024, and drove away from the destroyed village. In his rearview mirror, he watched the black earth recede, watched it shrink into the distance, watched it become something behind him rather than around him. But as he drove down the mountain road, as he put miles between himself and that cursed place, he noticed something that made his hands tighten on the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. A fly had landed on his rear window, just one at first, then another on the side mirror, then 3 more on the windshield, then a dozen clustering around the edges of his vision. By the time he reached the highway 20 minutes later, there were flies all over his truck, on every window, every mirror, every surface, as if they'd been waiting for him, as if they'd been expecting his visit, as if they were coming back with him. Diego stopped for gas 50 miles from the destroyed village. While paying inside the convenience store, the young woman behind the counter swatted irritably at flies. "So many flies this summer," she muttered, more to herself than to Diego. "Never used to be this bad. Never used to be any at all up here. Now they're everywhere. Started maybe a year ago and just keeps getting worse." Diego said nothing paid in cash, left quickly. At home on Saturday morning, June 15, 2024, Anna complained about flies in the kitchen as she made breakfast. She must have left food out overnight, she said. That's the only explanation. But Diego noticed she didn't swat them away when they landed on her arms anymore, on her hands, on her face. She just let them walk across her skin, as if it were normal, as if it were natural, as if flies landing on human flesh was something to be tolerated rather than prevented. His daughter Sophia, home for the summer from her first year at university, mentioned casually over lunch that a fly had gotten into her mouth at a party the previous night. "She'd swallowed it by accident," she said with a laugh, making a face of exaggerated disgust. But her laughter sounded hollow, performative, like she was acting out the response she knew was expected, rather than expressing genuine revulsion. "Did it taste like anything?" Diego asked before he could stop himself, the question escaping before his conscious mind could prevent it. Anna looked at him strangely, her fork pausing halfway to her mouth. "That's a weird question, Diego. Why would you ask that?" Diego didn't answer, just looked at his family, his wife, his daughter, his son Carlos, who was focused intently on his phone and ignoring the conversation, and tried to determine if they were still themselves or if something had changed, if something had gotten in. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, after the house had settled into silence, Diego sat at his computer in his home office and stared at Elena's email. He wanted to delete it. Wanted to purge it from his inbox and his trash folder and his entire digital existence. Wanted to erase it as thoroughly as the village itself had been erased. But instead his fingers moved across the keyboard almost independently, typing a response, forming words he hadn't consciously decided to write. "What do you want from me?" He hit send at 11:58 p.m. on Saturday, June 15, 2024. He didn't expect a response. Dead people don't answer emails. Deleted accounts don't receive messages. The laws of reality, however fractured they might be, don't allow for correspondence with the deceased. But within seconds, impossibly fast, instantaneously fast, as if the response had been composed before Diego had even sent his question, a new message appeared in his inbox. Diego opened it with hands that shook so badly he could barely control the mouse. The message was longer this time. Several sentences. An explanation of sorts. "You already did your part, Diego. You witnessed. You survived. You remembered. That's all we ever needed. The doors are opening now. They've been opening slowly for 15 years, one by one, in every place your story spread, in every mind that heard and wondered and doubted. You planted seeds in the world, and now they're flowering. We're already here. We've been here all along. We're just becoming visible now, becoming manifest, becoming real in ways we couldn't be before you opened the first door. Thank you for your service. Thank you for being our witness. The Lord of Flies is coming home." Diego stared at the screen, his vision blurring, his breath coming in short gasps. Behind him he heard buzzing. He turned slowly at midnight at the exact transition from Saturday to Sunday, at the moment when one day died and another was born. His office was full of flies, thousands of them, tens of thousands, covering the walls, the ceiling, his desk, his bookshelves. They weren't moving much, weren't flying around in chaos. They were just there, just waiting, just watching with their thousands of compound eyes. And in the center of the room they were beginning to form a shape. Diego recognized the process, remembered it from the plaza 15 years ago. The flies were assembling, coordinating, creating something larger than themselves. Something that used their bodies as components the way humans use cells. The shape was humanoid, roughly human-sized. It had arms and legs and a torso and a head, but it was made entirely of insects, entirely of flies, entirely of tiny bodies moving in impossible coordination. And it had Carmen's face, or something that looked like Carmen's face, or something that was using the memory of Carmen's face as a template. "It's time," the thing said, and its voice was multiple voices layered together, was young and old and male and female all at once. "Tell them, tell everyone, spread the word, let them know we're coming. Every person who hears is another door opened." Another invitation extended, another permission granted. Diego looked back at his computer screen, at the cursor blinking in a reply field, waiting for him to type something, waiting for him to respond, waiting for him to make a choice. "If I don't?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. The Carmen thing smiled, and its smile was too wide, was that same impossible smile he'd seen on Elena's hanging corpse 15 years ago. "Then we do it the old way, fire from the sky, starting here, starting with your family, starting with everyone you love. We can be patient or we can be immediate. The choice is yours to make, Diego. You chose to come to us. Now you choose how we come to the world." Diego believed it, believed every word. Believed with the certainty of experience, with the proof of his own eyes, with the evidence of that destroyed village where nothing would ever grow again. His finger moved to the keyboard, hovered, wavered. He thought of Ana upstairs, of Carlos and Sofia sleeping in their beds, of everyone he'd ever cared about, everyone who might be touched by whatever he unleashed or whatever he contained. Behind him the buzzing grew louder, became pressure, became pain. "Choose," the thing whispered. "Witness or victim, messenger or casualty. Choose now, Diego. Choose while choice still exists." Diego looked at his hands on the keyboard, at his wedding ring catching light from the monitor, at the photos on his desk of his children when they were young, before any of this, before the world had fractured and revealed the darkness underneath. He typed 4 words, "I'll be your witness," and pressed send. The buzzing stopped. The flies dispersed, flowing out of the room through gaps Diego couldn't see, disappearing into the house, into the world, into everywhere and nowhere. Diego sat alone in his office in the silence that followed, understanding with terrible clarity what he'd just done, what he'd agreed to, what role he'd accepted in something vast and old and utterly indifferent to human suffering. He opened a new document and began to type. The story of what happened in that village, every detail, every horror, every impossible thing. He typed for hours until dawn light crept through his window, until his family began to stir upstairs, until he had 15,000 words documenting everything, recording everything, bearing witness to everything. He titled it, "The Lord of Flies, A True Account." And then at 6:47 a.m. on Sunday, June 16th, 2024, he published it online, sent it into the world, made it public, made it available, made it viral. Within hours it had been read by hundreds. By the end of the day, thousands. By the end of the week, hundreds of thousands. It spread through social media, through forums, through every digital channel that allowed information to propagate and infect and replicate. And everywhere it spread, people started noticing more flies. Just a few at first, easy to dismiss, easy to attribute to weather or sanitation or random chance. But the flies kept coming, kept multiplying, kept appearing in places they shouldn't be, in numbers that couldn't be explained, with behaviors that weren't natural. And Diego watched it happen. Watched the infection spread, watched the doors open, watched reality beginning to fray at the edges as something ancient and patient finally achieved what it had been working toward for centuries or millennia or longer. He'd been the witness, had fulfilled his role, had done exactly what he was supposed to do. And now, 1 year later, in June 2025, the flies are everywhere. The news reports about them constantly. Scientists offer explanations about climate change and ecosystem disruption and population cycles. But Diego knows better. Diego understands. The Lord of Flies is coming home, door by door, mind by mind, witness by witness, and it's all Diego's fault. He thinks about this sometimes, late at night when he can't sleep, when he hears his family moving in the darkness, when he hears sounds that might be footsteps or might be wings, when he catches glimpses of movement that shouldn't exist. He thinks about going back to that destroyed village, about standing in that sterile ash, about ending things where they began. But he knows it wouldn't matter, knows the story is already told, the words already spoken, the witness already born. All that's left now is waiting, watching, counting the flies as they multiply, and remembering that cold certainty, that voice in his head from 15 years ago. Soon, it had said soon. And soon Diego understands now, as he sits in his office surrounded by flies that watch him with knowing patience, is finally here.